Hello, welcome to the first lesson in this module and indeed in this course. What we're going to do in this lesson is get started straight away building a new web application. And the web application is going to be called Text Circle. What this application is going to do is to allow lots of people to edit the same text document online at the same time. A bit like other sort of collaborative document editors you may have used, such as Google Documents, for example. So yeah, let's get started and see how we can build one of these things in Meteor from scratch. So I'm going straight into my console, and the first thing I do as usual is create a new application. So Meteor create text circle. Right, and what I want to do before I do anything else is kind of strip out all the code that I don't need. So let's open the folder, oops, and start editing. So, and I'm going to go into text circle there. So those are the three files it's created. Should be familiar to you by now that you know these three files that you get to start off with. So let's dive in and get rid of some of the junk. Right, so I've got all this stuff in client. I don't need all that. Bye bye. I'm going to keep the as server block because I'm going to write some startup code in a minute. And then yeah, let's have a look at the HTML. I'm going to rename my template to editor and get rid of the contents for now. Finally, I'm going to change the title. Okay, so that's my first basic set of edits to the files. And so if I just save those, run the app, I can just check that I haven't made any mistakes. Right, so I should, when I look at this in my web browser, have a dead simple app which just shows me a heading. Right, there we go. Welcome to Text Circle. Now what we're going to do is we're going to work through a few steps here. First of all, we're going to create a collection, a Mongo collection that we can store the document that everybody's editing in. And then we're going to install a special package which makes it easier to create a collaborative editor using a sort of library called Share.js. Share.js was originally developed to sit on the Node.js platform, which is kind of underpins Meteor, but it's been adapted to work with Meteor by a kind person and created as a package. So let's sort of work through those steps. So step number one, add a collection. Okay, and I'm going to say this .documents equals new mongo.collection, and it's going to be called documents. Right, let's just revise what that means. Well, there's a slight change here from how we've normally done it. Instead of having just document, normally we would just write documents like that. But in this case, we're going to write this documents, and that essentially allows the package that we're going to use access to this documents table, and that's quite important. That's just a slight edit that we make just to make the sort of collaborative text editing package work a bit better, or work at all. And what else have we got here? Yeah, Mongo collection, that's what we're creating. And then documents will be the sort of name that when we look at it in the Mongo database, it's kind of the low-level name of the collection that Mongo uses. So documents is the name that we use in our application to refer to it, and documents is how Mongo refers to it. And we're actually going to dive into Mongo and the underlying Mongo system in Meteor a bit more as we work through the course. But for now, that's just enough information. Next step, I want to put some starter data into my database. So var doc, actually, let's just do it like this. If documents find one, and I'm going to negate that, right? So if documents find one is a falsy value, okay, remember this kind of concept of falsy in JavaScript, where if you get something that's undefined or it's actually false or it's a zero, it's kind of referred to as being falsy. And then if you put that into a test on an if statement, that can be used as a false. So basically, if it finds one, if it doesn't find one, I use that exclamation mark to flip it to a true. So in other words, if there's no documents in there, then whatever's in my if statement will run. Okay, oops, so let's write that, no documents yet. So let's create one, documents, insert, and all I need to do is set a title for now, my new document. All right. So remember this code runs every time you start up the application. So whenever you run Meteor on the application name, it should run this startup code. And remember that anything that's in the database can be removed by typing Meteor reset. Good. So hopefully now we've got a document in our database. So if we do documents.findOne in the JavaScript console here, you can see we get one back. So and it's got the right title, my new document. So that is the document that we just inserted. And so remember that in the JavaScript console we can access the sort of global scope stuff that is built, that's in our application. And again, in this particular module we're going to be looking more in depth at variable scope. So where can you see which bits of data, and also considering the concept of reactivity a bit more deeply. But okay, so let's carry on just getting our basic collaborative editor working. The next step is to install the package. So I'm going to open a new window and go into the same folder. So I can leave the app running but kind of add a package. I don't know if it will let me do that. And the package name I actually prepared earlier, so I don't get the incorrect number of S's or Z's. Right, so the package is called share.js, the basic package, and I'm installing a particular part of it called CodeMirror. CodeMirror is a widget which allows you to display code, because we're going to sort of work on a collaborative code editor. But the thing we make could also be a collaborative just document editor for anyone who's writing normal documents. But we're interested in code, right? So we're going to make a collaborative code editor, and CodeMirror allows us to display code effectively in the browser. So rather than just having a plain sort of text area, we can format the code and lay it out nicely. Okay, so it installed a bunch of stuff there. CoffeeScript, which we don't need to worry about because that's not in this course. Handlebars, which is the templating library which underlies the templating library used in Meteor. So remember, that's called Spacebars. We've got share.js, which is the basic package. Share.js CodeMirror, which sort of builds on top of that and gives us the code viewing functionality. Finally, Mongo Live Data. More about that one later. Right, so I'm now, let's see if my app has reloaded. Yeah, it seems to have restarted, and it's grabbed the new packages, that's good. But I haven't changed my template yet, so I'll have to add another line in, which I've got down here. And I go into my template and paste that in. So this is my next step, is to actually make use of that package. It's kind of already doing some slightly magic stuff in the background, but which we're going to investigate later. But so far, I just need to tell it to run that. And remember how we used the ratings widget in the previous course when we created an image gallery with stars where people could rate an image, and we used a package to just display all those stars and give us that functionality. This is very similar. We're going to pull in a sort of customized template from this package, which just displays a text editing window for us, and also deals with lots of the fiddly stuff about keeping all the documents on people's different computers in sync. Because imagine that if you've got 10 people all editing the same document, you need to make sure that every change that everybody makes gets kind of somehow combined, and everybody ends up seeing the same document at the end. And we don't really want to have to deal with coding that, because that's really fiddly. We just want to use a sort of ready-made version of it, but make it work in our own way. All right, so the way we pull in that funky stuff is to basically call a template called share.js CM, which is the CodeMirror. It gives us a CodeMirror editing window, and we give it a document ID. Now, doc ID is going to have to be provided by a template helper. So inside the editor template, I need to create a helper which provides a doc ID. So let's jump into there and do that. Template, editor, helpers, and it was called doc ID, and it's a function, and I can just return the documents.findOne ID, hopefully. So that's that. So let's just track what's going on there again. So I've got this, I'm inside the editor template, and I'm trying to refer to something called doc ID. Now inside a template, the only variables and stuff that you get access to are the names of other templates, so things like that, and the sort of template helper data that you've passed in. So doc ID needs to come from a template helper. There's the template helper there. There is doc ID, and it basically just pulls a document out, the first one it can find, and passes back the ID. So let's have a look at that. Okay. Well, if I click in here, I've got some sort of editing going on, some sort of ability to type into the window, which is great, but I seem to have there's some gnarly error appearing here, which I don't like the look of. So I'm going to try and debug that a bit. It's something to do with templates. It says Blaze template there. So let's just see what's going on. Console log. So I suspect it might be something to do with documents find one. So I'm just going to print out whatever comes back from documents when I call find one. I'm going to reload it. Right. So you can see it's printing out undefined is coming out of that file. So the first time that, and then I've got the big error, and then next time it runs, it prints out object. Let's make that really clear. Put another print out line above it saying console log in doc ID helper. Okay, so it prints out doc ID helper first. So doc ID helper is printed out, and then I get an undefined. So basically documents find one is giving me an undefined, it's not giving me that object, which is a bit weird, because if I'm in here and I type documents find one, I don't get an undefined, I get a document. So why is it giving that? And then you see the second time it gets called, actually it gets called a second time there after the error, and then I do get a correct document. So it seems like that template helper function is being called twice. And a quick explanation of that is that the first time it gets called is when the template gets rendered first. And at that point, the collection, the Mongo collection, is not ready yet. So really your Meteor app is kind of running stuff in parallel, but not all of it's ready when you expect. So I'm trying to access the ID on the document, but the collection is not ready yet, so it gives me an undefined back. And then the collection becomes ready and the template re-renders because it notices a change in the collection, which is reactivity, and then it re-renders the template with the correct document, and I don't get the error the second time. So how do I get rid of the error? Well, I basically check what comes back. So if so var doc equals documents find one. So if doc, in other words, if doc is truthy, return doc doc dot ID, else return undefined, which is okay. So that basically means I'm not going to try and access ID on anything that isn't there. Right, and reload, and you see still gets called twice, doc ID helper, but I don't get the error now because I'm not trying to access something that isn't there. Right, and that's kind of working now, and time to find out the magic bit. Okay, get ready for this. So I'm looking at this in the Chrome browser, and I've got my document there. So if I jump over to Safari and load it up. Okay, and so I've got the two browser windows, got Safari there and Chrome over there. This is my you see that the text that I'm typing into Safari is appearing straight away over there in Chrome. HTML. Yeah, so I can write any text I like in there. Okay, so that is a collaborative text editor. So anyone can go onto this. Let's say you deployed this on the Meteor server like we saw in the previous course, how you can do it, and you got your mates to go and look at it. You'd all be able to collaboratively edit the same document. So why don't you try it out? Try and do a collaborative document editing session. And so what have we done there? Well, we've created the most simple possible collaborative document editor. There's one document, everyone's anonymous, you all just go and see the same document, but it works and it's not a lot of code. So let's very quickly review the code. So we had to make a template helper there. Well, let's start from the top. So we edited out some of the code we didn't want. We could pull in an editor template. The template is there. The editor template then pulls in another template, which is the share.js CM, which comes from that package we installed. Then the package needs to know a document ID, so we create a helper function on the template called docID, which basically pulls out a document from the database and passes the ID back if it's available. And then finally, we made sure there was a document available once the collection's ready, right? By defining a startup function on the server, which inserts a document when the server first starts up. And that's all we had to do. That is the code. That is complete code for a collaborative document editing system. So that's it. It's about 20 lines of code. We've created the simplest possible collaborative document editing system in Meteor. So we're going to develop this a lot more as we work through the course. So please come back in the next lesson and I look forward to seeing you there. This lesson is about reactive data. Reactive data is simply data that automatically tells us when it gets updated. And that's quite useful because it means if you've got several people looking at the same bit of data, then it tells those people that it's been updated and automatically gives them a new view on the data, which shows the new version. And let's just not think about it too much, but just dive in and see it in action in our web browser. So what I have here is my two web browsers. We've got Chrome at the top there and Safari at the bottom. And I'm going to just very quickly demonstrate really what reactivity is all about. So I've got basically two clients, if you like, connected to my application, and both of them are looking at this document. And what's going to happen is one of them is going to edit the document, and you'll see that it gets updated for them, but it also gets updated for the other person straight away, and vice versa. So in Safari, I can type hello from, let's just pull it down so we can see, hello from Safari. Okay, and if I jump over here, and I just rearrange it a bit so we can see that. If I jump over here and type hello from Chrome, you can see that that's exactly what's happening. So everybody's view is being updated, and I can have another browser connected again. Let's just do it for a laugh. Let's have Firefox and connect that up as well. And just put that one in that top corner over there. Hello from Firefox. So now you can see three windows being updated, all are sort of using this reactive model that's built in to Meteor. And what's going on here is a sort of very clear example of that. And there's different types of reactive data. We've got session data. So remember how we bound data to the session last time? I think it was an image filter that we were putting in there in the previous course, where we were working with that image gallery application, and we were able to remember the user's viewing preferences, and then but we can really put anything in the session, and if you've got a template which is viewing some data or depending on the session somehow, and the session changes, then basically that template helper will be rerun and the template gets re-rendered. And again, we saw that in the previous lesson. So think back to the previous lesson when we had a problem where we had some undefined thing coming out of the database. Well, it's exactly the same thing. So we had a template helper which depended on a database collection, which when the template first rendered, the database wasn't quite ready yet. So it just kind of, it sort of threw an error. And then very quickly the database became ready, and then it re-rendered the template again. So it was reacting to the fact that the database object, the collection in there had changed. So it's again, same thing. So this reactive stuff is really built into to Meteor at quite a low level. And what we're going to do in the following lessons is really see all the different types of variable that we can use which are reactive, and really get a sort of handle on when we should use each type of reactive object. In this lesson, we're going to look at one type of reactive data called the session. We've already seen the session in our previous course, where we used it to store information about the user's preferences about how they viewed a list of images. What we're going to do now is use the session just to sort of illustrate reactivity and how it works with the session. And what I want to do is show you how you can use reactivity to create a simple sort of clock function on your web page, which will show the time and update automatically. So first of all, let's see how we can simply show the current date and time on our web page in a template. So I go to the HTML, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a call to a template called date display, and then I need to define that template. And it's simply going to just display something called current date. Okay, so let's just recap that. So I made a call to a template called date display, so it needs to render something called date display. I then define that template, and all it does is just display some value called current date. And current date, remember how I need to pass that into the template using a helper. So let's just quickly write a helper for this template. So I'll just copy the name of the template into my clipboard before I go over here, and I'm going to say template dot, that's the name of the template, helpers, and define a new helper, and it's called current date. And the current date helper is going to basically pass back a new date. Object, return new date, like that. So let's just recap. So I've got a template called date display, which is being rendered above the editor, and it calls on something called current date. And I've got a template helper on that template called current date, which passes it that data. Let's just get that out of the quotes. We don't want that in quotes. And then I can go over here, and you can see I've now got the current date, and then below that is my collaborative editor, which I can still use, right? So that's the current date, but it very quickly becomes out of date, right? So how do I use reactive data to update the date automatically? Well, what I'm going to do is, instead of just returning the date every time the template renders, I'm going to sort of do it a slightly different way. I'm going to put the date onto the session. Now remember, the session is a reactive data source, so if it changes, then anything that depends on it will also change. So if I pass the date back from the session instead of back from just generating it manually, you'll see that it should react to changes on the session. So let's see if we can do that. So first of all, we'll just initialize it. So session set, and session is a built-in variable, and I'll call it current date, and I'll call it new date. So that's putting it on there, so whenever we sort of start up the app, it should run that code. Then I'm going to, instead of passing back new date, I'll pass back session.get current date. So let's just reload, save that, make sure it still works. Okay, so that still works, but then how do I make it reactive? Well, I mean, I could just very quickly demonstrate in the console how it's reactive. So I could do session set current date to, I don't know, 1974, before I was born. So I can just sort of manually, as soon as I change the session, I haven't told it to re-render that template or anything like that, but you see above the console there, it's actually updated it to show 1974, and I can put anything in there, blah, blah. Okay, great. But what if I want it to sort of turn it into some sort of clock? Well, I need a way to sort of automatically update the session. So you can see in the console, every time I could put a new date in. Okay, so it's current date. See that if I keep running that code, good. But Meteor actually has a function which allows you to sort of rerun a bit of code periodically. So we'll just write that now, and it's called meteor set time, set interval, and I pass it a function to call, and I say how often I want that function to be called. So I say once every second. I want you to basically update the time, update the session current date variable every 1000 milliseconds, save, and hopefully it's going to magically start working now. There we go. Let's just zoom in on that. So you can see that now it's updating the session. So let's just sort of think about what the sort of chain of things that's going on there. I kind of showed you each piece on its own anyway, but what's going on is you've got a template helper, which is providing some information about the date, and it's pulling that information from the session, and then the template is sort of rendering that information. It's simply just displaying the date. But if we then change the date that's stored in the session, you can see that that triggers the reactive chain, and Meteor's detecting, oh yeah, you've changed the session, you've changed some value in the session, and oh, you've got this template helper that depends on the session. So I'm going to re-render that template because it needs to update its view on that data. And that's a simple example of how we can use the session data and a reactive system in Meteor to sort of make a simple clock. In this lesson, we're going to talk about scope. Scope in general means what you can see. Okay, so think about the word telescope, which allows you to see at the stars and far out into space, or for example, the word periscope, which allows you to see if you're driving around in a submarine, if you're lucky enough to own one, you can actually pop your head up and have a look at what's on the surface of the water. Now, if we're programmers, then we talk about scope meaning what the program can see in any given context. So when you're writing your code, which data do you have access to, which variables? You will already have seen the concept of scope in Marco's lectures in the previous courses in the JavaScript sections, but we're going to revisit it a little bit here. So let's just see what happens to variables that we create in our JavaScript in Meteor. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm just editing the main JavaScript file for the Meteor application. And if I create a variable called myvar, and I'm going to put the value of 10 into it, and then let's see, I'm just going to allow me to display it. So you'll notice here that straight away, as soon as I start using template helper functions, I'm dealing with the problem of scope, right? So why do we need template helper functions? Well, actually, it's because the template doesn't have enough scope to see what's going on in your JavaScript files. And that's a deliberate separation because you want to sort of encourage the programmer to make the template as simple as possible and to only access data when they really need to. So that's why you kind of separate the data in the JavaScript layer from the data in the template. So you just pass things through when they're needed. And so that's exactly what the template helper function does. It's, if you like, it's a little periscope that pops out from the template and goes into the JavaScript and allows it to access some data in a very controlled way. So in order to allow my variable myvar there to be viewed within a template, I have to create a template helper function called myvar, and then I can access it like this, like that, myvar. Okay, and we should see the number 10. Yeah, there it is. Okay, oops. So that highlighted number there. So that's myvar being displayed. Now, of course, if I didn't have that, then the template won't have access to anything called myvar, and I might even get an error or something. But basically, the template no longer has access to myvar. So there we go. There's a good example of scope. There's another sort of aspect of scope, which is, okay, let's say we don't worry about templates for now, but we stay within the JavaScript. what can we see from inside our JavaScript? Well, a nice way to test that is, well, there's a couple of ways. One is to fire up the console in JavaScript. So this console in the browser here has effectively the sort of same scope as of any module in your application. So can I see my var inside here? My var is not defined. Right, okay. So although my var is sitting there in the JavaScript, I can't access it from the console. How about session? Can I see that? Yeah, okay, I can see session. So that tells you that my var, even though I've created it as a variable, is somehow being sort of hidden. And this is kind of how Meteor works. When your programs become more complex, and indeed in the previous course when we started building a more complicated application, we started separating our functionality into different files. And what happens is Meteor actually wraps up each file as a separate module. And then each module has its own scope. So this my var that we created is inside that first module, okay? So I'll just demonstrate that by creating another module. Simplest way to create another module is to just create a new file, new JS file inside your application folder, and then let's see if you can access it. So my console log my var. That's effectively trying to look into the other module and see if I can access my var. Now, so I've got some nasty error messages coming out of my server here, and it's saying reference error, my var is not defined. Okay, so the server doesn't know anything about my var. So you can see that I'm trying to access sort of variables from one module inside another. So you've got within each of your JavaScript files that you create when you're authoring your application, it has its own scope. So what else can we say about scope? Well, session, obviously the session has global scope. Global scope means you can tell if something's global scope because you'll be able to see it from the template, sorry, from the JavaScript console on the browser. I'm just going to get rid of this error generating thing. Okay, so hopefully we'll be back to normal and happy again. Yeah, so I'm no longer trying to access my var from a separate module. Now, so the console is a good place to sort of test out sort of visibility and that kind of thing. So you can see what, this represents the browser window itself. You can see there's a bunch of stuff sitting on there. And interestingly, there's probably some different things. We've got code mirrors sitting on there. Remember we created that, and remember we bound documents to that. So that's another kind of scope, if you like, or another namespace where is the sort of browser window itself, and that has a bunch of stuff. And that's kind of separate from the different scopes that Meteor creates. So actually it's quite a complicated thing going on. But you don't need to worry too much. What about the collections? I mean, if I was to say documents, you can see that collections are in global scope. And as we saw in the previous course, remember in the previous course when we tried to sort of break into our own application, you can imagine that having these things in global scope, they're sort of visible from anywhere in the app and indeed to anyone. So you need to make sure those doors are locked if they need to be, and that they can only be opened in a certain way. And later in this course, we're actually going to explore some more sophisticated ways to secure those sort of global collections and things, which are more sophisticated than the things we saw in the previous course. We saw allow and deny, but there's interesting other ways of doing it. So that's a little exploration and discussion of the concept of scope and a sort of practical examples of when you can see things in your application, when you can't see them. And obviously the session is global scope, variables are locally scoped to different modules, and even inside functions you can have local variables inside there that are not visible even to the module layer. So yeah, it's quite a sophisticated topic, but hopefully that's been a bit of revision for you. Right, in the previous lesson, we were playing around a bit with variables and putting variables in different places in our application and seeing which bits of the application could see which variables and so on. And that topic was called scope. What we're going to do in this new lesson is sort of undo some of that test code and then move on with the implementation of our collaborative text editor. And so let's go in and remove that code first of all. So first of all, I'm going to start in my template files and remove all this stuff about dates, because we don't really need that. We're going to strip it right back to the minimum of what we need. Okay, so there's the minimal template for our collaborative text editor. And it's great. It's really not a lot of code for what it can do. And it just shows you the power of that share.js library. Then let's jump over to the sort of application code in the JavaScript file, which is text circle JS, and knock that out as well. So we don't need this variable anymore. We don't need to set the counter or the interval, and really we don't need the date display helpers, and that's just about it. So back to the minimum implementation of a collaborative text editor window. Okay, and so let's just run the app. Oh, one more thing. I've just seen there's an extra file there that we created when we were looking at this kind of concept of modules. So we can take that out as well. So bye-bye to my module. So we're back to our original 3 files with the minimum implementation. So since we've done all that hacking around and we may have deleted something by accident that we didn't want to delete, let's just test the app, make sure it's working okay. So I run Meteor. Okay, Meteor's already running. Sorry. Okay, so I already have my app running in the background. It told me Meteor is already running, so I must have had another window with Meteor running. That might well happen to you. There it is, and let's reload the app. And you can see, hopefully I should be able to edit this. That's great. And just to make sure that I haven't broken the collaborative editing, I'm just going to load up another browser window and point it at the same place. Make sure I can do my collaborative editing. Yeah, right, so I just deleted all the text. You can see in both browser windows it's still working. Right, so we've stripped out that test code where we were investigating this concept of variable scope, which we'll revisit as we work through the course, because it's quite a key concept of, which data can you see where. And now we're going to sort of think about how we can sort of fix the design and make it start to look a bit more professional. And as you might imagine, we're going to be using the Bootstrap library to do that, because that's kind of quite a quick route to doing that. So the first step is to install the library. And so if I can actually do that while the app is running. So here I am. I'm inside my application folder in the command line. I can do Meteor add, and the name of the package is TWBS, Twitter Bootstrap, and I think there are other Bootstrap packages available, but this is just the sort of, I think, most widely used one. So it's adding that, and you can see, hopefully, you can see that in the window where the app is running, it's what we call bounced. It's bounced the server. It's kind of restarted the app, and that should be up and running. So if we just have a look at the window now, I don't know if you can notice any difference there. Just think about what the font looks like. Okay, yeah. So the heading has now become a sans serif font. So you can see the Bootstrap library's kind of done its magic and fixed our design so that it's kind of gone more neutral. But we want to go a step further than that. I'd also like to add a navigation bar. And so before I just kind of go off building the new design, I just want to sort of remind you of this concept of wireframing. So normally before you go ahead and try and build a design, it's a good idea to do some sort of wireframe, which is the kind of simplest, most possible schematic of what you want your design to look like. And based on that, you might then go and do a more elaborate design. But normally you'd sort of do a wireframe, implement it, then maybe think about a more elaborate design and implement that. So here's a wireframe for what I want to do. So I just want to have a navigation bar at the top and then the editor below. And as we work through this course, I'm going to show you some more elaborate wireframes as we add more functionality into this system. But this is good enough for now. So we've got, and you notice that text circle is written at the left. It's not a big kind of clumsy heading anymore. We're just going to have a sort of branding type thing on the left there. So how do we do this in Bootstrap? Well, I don't know about you, but I certainly haven't got a good enough memory to remember all of those different classes that we use for all the different components in Bootstrap. especially considering that normally, you build a nav bar once and then you move on, right? So you're not using these classes all day, every day. So the best thing to do is to jump to the Bootstrap web page and grab some boilerplate code and work with that. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to Google Bootstrap components, which gives me the kind of core set of components for Bootstrap and example code for using them. Here we are, and I'll jump down to the nav bar on the right there, and I'm looking for navs, right? And I'm going to do a kind of fixed nav, which is the nav bar that sort of floats over the top. So if I look for fixed top, you can see I can get some boilerplate code right there, and chuck that into my template. So we'll put it in the body. So there's your nav bar, tab it in properly. That's where the content for the nav bar goes. And remember, we can put in comments to remind us. So end nav container. That's just an HTML comment to remind us what the structure of this page is. So as you add more and more divs, because your nav bar becomes more elaborate, you can lose track of which div you're ending here or there. So it's always good to put a little comment in to remind yourself. And then I actually want to put a link in there which has this brand look. See where it says brand there? I want one of those. So I'm going to see what the code looks like for that. There we go. And you just basically make a link like that. And drop that in. So that's going to be on the left-hand side of my navigation bar, and I'm going to put text circle in there. So let's just save that. Oh, get rid of the heading. Save that. Jump over to the page. Right. Okay. So there I've got my navigation bar. That's looking pretty good. And so it's kind of responsive by default, if you like, because that's how Bootstrap works. That's great. So now I need to make sure the editor works. And if I click in here, you'll see I can no longer use the editor. And if you see that happening, you might panic and think, oh no, I've broken everything and I've no idea how Share.js works. That's terrible. But it's simpler than that. And if you've done course 2, you will probably remember this problem, which is that the fixed navigation bar actually sits on top of the page. And then if you scroll down the page, actually kind of moves up like that below the nav. So what's happening at the moment is the editor is there and the navigation bar is sitting on top of it. So we are going to have to shove the page content down a bit. And that's no problem. So let's just put the editor inside a container. Class equals container. And I'm also going to put an extra class on it called top margin. Whoops. And then top margin doesn't exist. So I need to create that class in my CSS file, which I've got open over here. And so top margin, and I'm just going to do margin top 50 pix. So 50 pixels, that should sort of shove it down enough to be below the navigation bar. And you can see possibly in the background there, it's already fixed. So my editor is back in business. This is the editor. And as I said, because it's this collaborative thing, you never know when you've kind of broken something. And it might seem to work in one browser, but it's not successfully passing things over to another one. So we can just check this is still working. Okay, good. So now we've got 2 browsers interacting. So our interactivity is still working there. And we've got a navigation. So that's that. So we've now implemented a basic Bootstrap type of structure in our templates. And we've got a fixed navigation bar at the top, and then the editor sitting below. Right, so we've added a more professional look to our web page by adding the Bootstrap library. And what we're going to do now is add some really cool functionality, which actually turns it into a proper tool for developers. So right now it's just a tool that allows lots of people to edit the same text file, and that's great. But imagine if we could have instead of just a text file, it was an HTML file that everybody was editing. And not only that, that it had a real-time preview of how that HTML file would look if you looked at it in a browser. Let's see how we can implement that. So the first step is to actually just look at the wireframe and see what we need to change to make it look how we need. So this is the original wireframe here, just the nav bar at the top and then an editor window. What we're going to change it to is this. This is with an editor window and a preview window. And the idea is that people type code into the editor and then it gets previewed how, if it's HTML code, it will be previewed in the other window in a way that the browser would show that page if it was given that HTML. So the way we do this is we have to actually dig into the share.js library a bit and sort of configure the editor, because what we want to do is every time they make an edit in the editor, or every time the text in that editor changes, we want to sort of re-render the preview. So first step in that process is to, as I say, implement the wireframe. The second step is to see if we can get access to the text that's currently in the editor. And the final step is then pass that text and render it in the preview. So let's do step one. So we need to define a responsive bootstrap grid, and I'm going to quickly write the code for that in the HTML file. So we want a 2-column grid. So see if you can guess what I'm going to write for a 2-column grid. So first of all, I have a row, and then inside the row I have 2 divs, one for each column. Col MD6. So I'm going to say if it's a medium window, take up 6 rows in the grid. So if we were to remind ourselves what that all means, so we did cover responsive bootstrap grids in quite a lot of detail in the previous 2 courses, but the headline is there are 12. Unfortunately, I don't have 12 fingers, but I can show you 10. Imagine there's 12 fingers here. We have 12 columns and available, but we actually want to have a 2-column layout. So that means each column takes up 6 of the available 12. So we have half and half. So we define 2 columns, each of which is taking up 6. So that should give us 2 equally sized columns in our layout. Second step is to then create a new template, which is going to be called viewer, which I'm going to render in the second column. And I'll define that template here. Preview goes here, so that's just to tell me what's going to happen. Make sure I've saved that. Then I'm going to fire the apps up and running and reload. So you see now I've got my editor over here and I've got my preview over on the right hand side there. So I've got my basic wireframe implemented. So that's stage 1. So stage 2 out of 3 is to then get access to whatever the text is in the editor window, and to do that whenever the editor window text changes, because the point is it's live coding. So it means every time a change gets made, I want to sort of do something, right? How do we do that? Well, actually we have to tell the editor. So remember this is the template which renders the editor, and so this share.js CM tells the share.js library to generate a special code mirror editor for us. And if we want to reconfigure that code mirror editor such that it tells us when it gets updated, we need to pass it a config value. And so the config, just like docID was a helper. So remember, docID is just a helper function on the template, which is defined here. Config is another helper function on the template. So let's just define another helper function, config. And this is a function, function, and it works like this. Now, unlike the docID one, docID just passes back a number basically, but config doesn't pass back a sort of value, it passes back a function. So we return a function. And if we write this the right way, then we can actually just say something like this. Let's just see what editor is. You see the console log is happening. So just to remind you what's going on there. So I've basically told it when it gets configured, when the editor is getting configured, I want you to just print out whatever the state of the editor is. So you can see in the console I've got my editor there. So you see it's this kind of code mirror object. So that's showing you that in that function we get access to the editor. And that's what we want. We want to tell, we're now going to reconfigure that editor slightly by adding an event listener. The event listener will be like this. So editor on change. So whenever a change happens, call a function. And the function that I want you to call is past the editor and some sort of info about the change, right? And we're only interested in the CM editor. So let's just do console log CM editor get value. Right, so what have I done there? So I've defined a sort of configuration function for the editor that's going to get called whenever that editor gets instantiated. And the configuration function then takes the editor and sets some properties on it. And one of the things it's setting up is an event listener. So whenever that code mirror editor, which is the editor which we're using, gets changed, in other words, the text in the editor changes, I want you to just print it out. So let's see if that works. Wait for it to reload. Does it work? So you see in the console there, every time I'm changing stuff, it's printing out the complete contents of the editor, which is what I want. And then if I was to test it over here, this is Safari editing, right? Okay, so that means that even if I'm in another browser editing, the content gets shared and the change event is fired. So that's great. So that means if anyone else edits the file, I still get the latest version of the content. Perfect. So that's step 2. I've got access to the content of the text editor window now. The final step is to take that text and use it to render it out in that preview window. So how do I do that? Well, I need to go into my viewer template and add an iframe like this. And the ID is going to be viewer iframe, so I can access it. And what I'm going to do is so use this iframe to sort of dynamically render my code. Now, the thing with an iframe is, unlike a div or some other kind of HTML tag, is it essentially contains a complete, fresh HTML DOM, document object model. So it means that you've got a whole HTML document to play with. And that's great because it means whatever the user is typing into the code editor, they can write a complete HTML document in there, and then it will be effectively rendered in the iframe. Whereas if I'd used a div or something and stuck some HTML into there, it might not work because you can't have certain tags inside div tags, right? So iframe is the highest level tag, if you like, kind of equivalent to a new document. Okay, so how do I take the code that they're typing in the text window and cause the iframe to render it? Well, I need to do some jQuery to do that. And I say like this, I have a jQuery selector. So that selects the iframe. And I say, get the contents of the iframe, find the HTML tag inside the iframe. So remember the iframe's got a complete HTML document in it. So I find the HTML tag, and then I'm going to inject into the HTML tag some new contents. Editor get value, like that. Okay, so there's the magic spell, which hopefully works. So the magic spell basically chains a bunch of functions together that take the code from the text editor, get the iframe, and inject the code into the iframe. Let's see if I've done it correctly. Okay, so this is my editor. Okay, that's pretty good, but okay, what's the point of that? Why would I want to just repeat it? Well, let me show you when the magic happens. If I actually type an h1 tag, this is the title. Have a look in the editor window the viewer window over there. It's actually applying the correct formatting for an h1 tag. This is a subheading, and indeed I can create any kind of HTML I want. Let's just do a list. Okay, so I can do that, and I can add a button, and notice that I'm not saving and reloading or do any of that kind of stuff. It's real time. It's a live coding environment. It's responding to me changing the contents of that editor in real time. And not only that, of course, if I'm in the other browser and I'm making an edit, it actually appears reactively. So I've got my collaborative aspect still. So let's say I put a button in the code there, button, and I'm going to say click me. Right, and then I'm just going to show you that you can even specify an event listener on click. So when they click the button, alert, ta-da, like that, okay? I'm not saving or anything, it's all doing it in real time. And I click that button and then the alert fires, okay? So I can basically type any old HTML code I want into the left-hand side. It gets injected into the iframe and rendered by the browser into what it would look like. So effectively, it's a collaborative HTML editing environment with a real-time preview. So there you go. And that wasn't too much code. I mean, look at it. Not a lot of code in the JS there, and really very little code in the template, most of which is just layout code, which is how it should be. Okay, so there we go. We've created a collaborative online HTML editing environment. Well done, you finished the first module. So now we have a fully functional collaborative text editing environment up and running. So let's carry on through the rest of the modules and build on top of that and make it far more functionally rich. Welcome to the first lesson in this module. In this lesson, we're going to add user account functionality to the collaborative HTML editor. And we've already worked with user accounts if you've taken the previous course. And we're going to sort of do it in a similar way this time. But of course, we're going to be using the user accounts in a different way because it's a different application. We're also going to show you how a couple of ways to customize how the user login forms operate. So first of all, we're going to install the basic user accounts packages, which allow us to have built-in user accounts, which is where Meteor actually stores the users in our own database. Now remember, there are other types of user account packages which allow people to log in using one of their social media accounts or a GitHub account, for example. So let's install that basic package, which is called accounts password, Meteor. So I'm in my web folder here. You can see the 3 files, and if I do Meteor search accounts password, you'll see the this is the one I want, which is the sort of basic the basic account system. So let's just add that, Meteor add accounts password. There it is, and it installed some other sort of supporting packages. So that gives me the sort of basic underlying functionality. And what you can actually do is you can completely build your own sort of set of forms and event handlers and everything to deal with the user accounts, but use the underlying kind of database provided by that account. But we're going to use the built-in UI, which is called Accounts UI, which means that we don't have to write a load of forms and all the form checking code and everything. So you can see that brings up more options because, as you might imagine, lots of people have created packages which make the sort of user accounts forms look nicer. So let's do that one. Let's just install the basic one. Right. So I've just installed 2 new packages. Now remember, there's actually there's a whole packaging system in Meteor that you can control from the command line. So for example, now I've just been searching, but for example, I can also list the packages which are currently on my system, or at least in this web application, and you can see which ones you've kind of added. So there they are: accounts password, accounts UI, a couple of others which we'll be working with later. Then there's the basic platform. There's the Share.js system, which allows us to do the collaborative editing. And finally, the Bootstrap package. So Meteor list shows you a list of all the different things. So I've got my 2 basic account packages installed. And now I'm able to go into the code, and I don't want the JS. I don't need to write any JavaScript. And I can just put a login button on my navigation bar. So the simplest possible way to do that is like this, login buttons. So remember, I haven't defined a template called login buttons. Login buttons is a template that comes with that accounts UI package. So we save that, jump over to the template, and you'll see that now I've got a sort of slightly clumsy looking button there. And let's just see how it works, and then we can customize how it looks. So let's say I want to create an account for test@test.com with the password test1234. Create account. Here we go. So now I'm logged in as that user, and we can then push that over to the right-hand side of the nav, which is where it normally appears on websites at the moment. So we need to go back into the code and wrap it up in some Bootstrappy code. Now, when it comes to working with Bootstrap, it's kind of tempting to just not go and look at the Bootstrap documentation and just hack in your own CSS to shove things around. And that's not always the best way to do it, because you might end up kind of clashing with some of the Bootstrap CSS or something. So normally when I'm working with Bootstrap, I will actually sort of have a look around in the Bootstrap documentation to see if there's a sort of a way of doing things already. Well, what I want to do is basically make my login buttons template appear a bit nicer in the nav, so it sort of sits in the middle, more like the text circle text does there. I don't want it sort of sitting at the top there. So I would go and have a look in the Bootstrap documentation, see how I might normally do that, because there's loads of examples of nav bars, so I'll show you what I mean. I'm on the Bootstrap components page here, and you can see that's kind of almost exactly what I'm after. The idea that the text is kind of formatted in the right way and it's sitting in the right place. So I could simply get that boilerplate code and go over to here and use it to wrap up the template, which is cool. And that's that. So let's just have a look at that. So it looks better already. And then I can also shove it over to the right, navbar right. Okay, so it's popped over to the right there. So now I've actually, now I've actually got a page that sort of lays out using the Bootstrap styles, and the navbar looks a bit nicer. Okay, and we've got sort of functional user accounts. In the next lesson, we're going to just see how we can customize how that user account functionality works a little bit. But for now, we've got working user accounts. You can sign in and sign out, and let's see where we go from there. We're now going to take a little aside and find out how we can actually look at the underlying database which Meteor is working with in our applications. So far it's kind of been hidden from view. It's just this mysterious thing that we can dump things into and pull things out of. But there's actually quite a lot going on in there, which it's really interesting to have a poke around and see what's happening. So first of all, let's find out what underlies the user accounts. And the way we do it is with the Mongo shell. So let's just check if your app is running. So if you run Meteor, okay, looks like it's already running. So to access the Mongo shell, we type Meteor Mongo, and that logs in to the local database server. So the default database server in Meteor is Mongo. And when we first installed Meteor, it actually installed the Mongo server for us, as well as the Meteor layers on top of that, and indeed the Node.js system. So there's a whole bunch of components inside that Meteor framework which get installed automatically and we don't need to worry about. But what we're sort of now going to unveil one of those, which is the database server. And Mongo is a standard database server which is of the category kind of NoSQL. So we might call it we would call it a NoSQL database. There are other types of databases, and some of them you can use with Meteor. For example, the SQL database is MySQL and PostgreSQL. And so what the difference between these and the Mongo is to do with how you store your data. So Mongo is quite open-minded about how you kind of store your data. You don't have to specify schema beforehand, like table structures. You just chuck stuff in there and kind of get on with it. And that's really a nice way of working with data for certain applications. So let's just see what's in there anyway. So we're logged into Mongo, and what we can do is ask it which collections it have. Now collections may be familiar if you remember that in our JavaScript code we defined a collection called documents, and when we created it we actually specified a string containing the word documents, and that's what the Mongo collection is actually going to be called. And indeed there we have a collection called Mongo. So we can do DB, which refers to the database, and the name of the collection, which is documents, and find one, which will pull out a document. There it is, and actually there is only one document in there. So if I do find count, you see it gives me a count of 1. So that's because everybody works on the same document, because we've only got a single document in our collaborative document editor. How about users? Well, you see there's also another table, a collection in there called users. The reason I'm getting confused between the word collection and table is in more traditional databases like MySQL and PostgreSQL, we talk about tables. In Mongo, we talk about collections. So there's a users collection there. So db.users find one. Okay, there's a user account, and let's just see how many there are. Right, there's 1. And if I was to go back to my application and actually create a new user account, you'll see that call it test2 at test.com, test. Right, there's now 2 accounts sitting there in the thing, and we can look at both of them by calling find and telling it to prettify. If we don't prettify it, it just looks like this, just a kind of flat data set, but pretty kind of puts some formatting in there so it's a bit easier to read. So what does a user account look like? Well, here is one here. Okay, so we've got an ID, which is one of these IDs we've seen before. Created at, when was that user account created? Then their password, which is encrypted. So I think I typed in test, and you can see that turns into a load of gibberish there. So it's a good idea to encrypt your passwords in your database in case anyone gets hold of the contents of your database, and then they'll just have all the passwords as well. So encrypting them makes it a little bit harder for people to then access the passwords in plain text. So that's that, and then we can also see if there's any other collections. And just noting that the users collection was created by the package. So when we install the package and start it up, the package, the user accounts package, does a bunch of clever stuff and creates the users collection and then automatically puts things into it and manages that for us, all sort of easily done with that plugin. Then we've got some more stuff in there. Docs and ops I'm interested in. So if I do db.ops.find.count, let's see how many are in there. Oh, 40. Right, so there's 40 things in ops. What do they look like? Find one. And you'll see that an op relates to a document, which is interesting. So if I do db.documents.findOne ID, you'll see actually it's the same ID as the only document in the database. So this operation pertains to that document. And let's see, if I was to, let's run that command 40. If I then start editing the document, here is some new text, right? You'll see that created 67 new entries in the ops table collection. That means that whenever I'm making edits, things are being dropped into ops. And ops is part of the share.js library, and it's a built-in thing that every time you make an edit, it automatically propagates into the ops table. And the reason we can't just, you might think, well, why do we need to store all these edits? Well, the thing is, imagine someone's making all their edits on a mobile device. or on a device with a poor connection, and they build up all these edits and they're happily coding, and then none of it's getting through to the central server, and then somebody else is busy hacking away, and they've got their, and then you end up with sort of two different versions of the document because they're not instantly kind of propagating. And this, you can imagine this would be quite common with lots of people, and then suddenly they get their connection back and all the edits go blurt into the database, and we need to somehow make sure that everybody then has the most up-to-date document. And so this is the kind of magic bit of Share.js. So it has an algorithm which can collect all of the edits that everybody's made and then somehow figure out what to show everybody so that it makes sense. So, you know, let's say someone's made a bunch of edits to a bit of text which they've then deleted, but then they carry on editing it before the delete happens. You know, that could be a problem. So the ops table is keeping track of it, and there's an algorithm which Share.js has which works on that and turns it into a meaningful document for everybody. Okay, so that's just a quick aside where we've looked at the Mongo shell and found out how we can look at the underlying database and the collections that are being created by these different packages that we install. So yeah, just go in there, have a poke around, and you know, see what you can find. Now we're going to learn a new Meteor technique, and it's called methods. Methods allow you to specify a central point where all of your changes to your database happen, so that any code that wants to change the database has to call in to a method to get that done. That means you can put all of your sort of checking and security code in one place. It's kind of similar to allow and deny, but generally the Meteor community prefers this technique when you're dealing with more complicated applications. So that's why we're showing you in this more advanced course. What are we going to try and do with methods? Well, what we want to do is maintain a list of all the users who are editing each document in the database. So as we expand the functionality throughout the course, and we've got multiple documents, for each document we know who's been editing it. So how are we going to do it? Well, first of all, let's just see how the sort of insecure way of doing an insert into the database. And so we might take our code here where we're responding to an edit. So every time someone edits, that's a kind of guaranteed point where we know someone's editing the document. We might just say, well, define a new collection first of all, editing users equals new Mongo collection, and we'll call it editing users. Remember, the string we pass is the name of the collection inside the Mongo database. This value is the name of the collection on our kind of code side. So all I'm going to do is just say editing users, insert, I don't know, just some data user Matthew, just to show the sort of data going into the database. Okay, so assuming there aren't any errors, every time I make an edit, I should be getting some stuff in that. Well, let's clear it first. So I'll just clear out anything that was there before, and then I'll start making some edits. And if I do find and count, see I've got 15 entries in there at the moment. If I keep typing, each time I press a key on the keyboard, I'm getting another entry in that database. What do they look like? Let's look at one or a few. Okay, so they're just like the same thing. So they've got a unique ID there, and then they've got that object, you know, that data that I passed in. Right, so that's great, we can make inserts, but the problem is that's not very secure, because as I said, we don't want all the bits of code to be able to directly insert into the database. We want to put another layer in there called the method layer, which sort of allows control over when inserts happen. So how do we implement a method layer? Well, first of all, we do Meteor remove insecure, which is the package which makes it easy to do inserts. So that insecure package is great for when you're starting and you just want to try things out, but when you want your app to get a bit more serious, it's time to remove it. And let's see what happens now we've removed it. Well, I'm getting lots of insert failed messages over here in the console. That means that I'm now no longer able to just insert stuff as and when I like. So I have to do it through a method. So let's define a method. Meteor methods. And the method's going to be called add editing user. And it's a function. Okay, and it's basically going to do the same thing as that, but just inside a method. Therefore, it's the only place it can happen. It can't happen anywhere else apart from if you're on the raw server like that. Then I just call the method. So I do meteor.call and then the name of the method, which is add editing user. So every time they make an edit on the editor, now it's going to sort of update the preview box that we created before, and then it's going to call this meteor method to add an editing user. So now we should be functional again. Okay, right, so no errors coming out this time. And if I count count them, I'll see they should be going up again every time I make an edit. Okay, so they're going up again, right. So I've now successfully sort of put a method into place. I put the method layer in there, and then obviously I put my security code inside the method, and then anytime I want to do an insert, it has to come through that. So the next step is to put some meaningful data into that collection. And so what I'd like to do is actually put in a kind of object which looks something like this. So I'd like to be able to basically have, well, it's going to have a unique ID, and it's going to be linked to a document. So I've set a document ID in there, which will be the document that these users are editing. And then I'm going to have another thing inside it, which is basically an object again, and that's going to contain all of the user IDs and then information about those users. Okay, so when I want to, I can then pull this back out of the database and use it to display in a template very easily all the kind of associated users to a given document. So how do I create this thing? Well, so I've got a few things I'm going to need access to. I'm going to need access to a user, and I'm going to need access to a document. So let's see if we can do that. So var doc user, and I'm going to try and get one here. So doc equals documents, find one. We've only got one document at the moment. We'll update it later to have multiple ones. If not doc, return, no doc, give up. So don't do anything if there's no document. Next, I want to get a user. So if not this user ID, so inside a method you can quickly access the user ID with this.userid, return, no logged in user, give up. Okay, so a couple of tests. Right, so if I get to this point, now I have a doc and possibly a user. So user equals meteor user dot profile. Okay, that should give me access to the user profile, which is basically some information. And if we bounce into here, and I haven't made any errors, meteor dot user, you can see it's giving me an object back. So meteor user dot profile should give me another object which has got my first name, last name, and bits and bobs, that I'm female, apparently. I must have pressed the wrong button there. And so that's how you can access the user data. So I've grabbed that here, same way. So first, but I do check if they're logged in first, because I might get a problem otherwise. So I've got a user and I've got a document. So the next step is to basically say, okay, so I've got the document. So let's try and construct this object here. And that's going to be called e-users for editing users, okay? E-users, I'm going to construct that object, e-users equals, and it's going to have a document ID, which is, well, first of all, let's see if I can just pull one out of the database to start off with. Editing users.find one that matches this document. Okay, so it should be doc ID is equal to doc.id, right? So I'm going to look see if there's a set of editing users for this document already, because I don't want to have to duplicate them. And so if not e-users, okay, so if I don't have one, then I need to sort of build the object, right? So e-users equals an object which will have, well, I don't need to set the ID because that will be created when I insert it. The doc ID is going to be doc.id, and then the users I'm going to set up in a minute. Right, so that's if I don't have one, then I basically create a simple one there. And then just here, I'm not going to insert user anymore. I'm going to insert e-users. Okay, the final step is to just do a quick test on this code before... Well, yeah, let's do a quick test. Right. Okay, so I'm getting an error, and the reason is, you know, that basically it's not very happy. So I've got that one there. The reason it's not happy is because I'm trying to create another e-user with the same ID, and it's not happy about that because I've pulled one out of the database and then I've tried to insert it again. So once there's one in there, it pulls it out and it tries to insert it again. You can't insert two things with the same ID. So what you do instead is you do an upsert. And what that does is, instead of just inserting it blindly, it checks if there's one already and replaces it. Otherwise, it creates a new one. Okay? But we have to specify a filter, which is that the ID is equal to e-users ID. In other words, if there's one already in the database with this ID, just update it. If there isn't one, then insert it. That's called an upsert. Okay, and that's a Mongo thing. Right, so that should get rid of those errors. Okay, good, no more errors. And then you can see that's my object coming in there. So let's just knock them out again, get rid of all the entries, and so we can clean out all the test entries there. So I've made a couple of edits. Okay, that's the only one in there now. So it's got an ID and it's got a doc ID. The final step is to put that user data on there. And so I just say, I'm going to say user.lastEdit. I'm just going to remember when they last edited. And then I'm going to say e-users dot users. Well, let's see if it hasn't got one yet. I need to put that in there. So users is another object, okay, and then e-users dot users, and then the key is user. This dot user ID. So basically, I'm adding something to that users object, and it's going to be equal to user. Finally, and then I'll just clean out the database again, and so hopefully what it should do now is, like, every time a new user logs in, it creates a new entry in there for that user. So let's just see if that works. So I've made a couple of edits. Okay, so you see now I've got my complete object. So I'll just copy that out and show you the one I was aiming for. So that's what I was aiming for. This is what I've ended up with in the real database. So I was aiming for an ID, a doc ID, and then a set of users. I've got an ID, a doc ID, and a set of users, right? So I'm happy with that, but I just want to test it with just another user logging in. So here's one I prepared earlier. So here's another user logged in. I am logged in, I think. And so you see, if I look at that thing again, you see another user has appeared. And hopefully every time that one of those users makes an edit, it should update the last edited thing. Right, so that's it. What have I done there? So I've used the Meteor method to add an additional security layer to my application. And then I've sort of created an insert command in there, which every time someone makes an edit, it basically updates a list of editing users for a given document. And what I can do in the next lesson is then pull out that information and send it to a template so I can render a nice list of all the users who are editing a document. Wow, that was a little bit tricky, wasn't it? We had to construct quite a complicated object there and put it into the database. But hopefully, you've got the example code and you can get that all working on your own systems. Now, what we're going to do now is take that data and try and display it in a template so we can show how the system can react to different users coming on and starting to edit the document. So let's just see how we can do that. What I want to do is basically create a new row at the top of the display that shows all the editing users. So really I should go back to my wireframe and look at my row and design it again. So let's just sort of just go to the code instead and put it straight in. So what I want is a new row, and oops. So I grab the code from the previous row and I drop it in there, get rid of that, and then it's, instead of it being MD6, it's going to take up all 12 columns in the grid. So there it is, and my 12 column row, and instead of pulling in the editor, I want to pull in the new template, which is going to be called editing users. Okay, so the editing user list is going to pop up the top, and then I need to create the template. So I copy that old template, paste it, get rid of the contents, call it editing users, and finally I'm going to then need to write some helper functions for the template so that the template has some data to work with. And as I say, the tricky thing is that our data, which if you remember, let's just go back into the old Meteor Mongo there. Our data looks like this, and you'll notice that the users thing is not actually an array. Look at those curly brackets, that is not an array. Ideally I'd just have users as an array for my template anyway, but it's not ideal for the way I'm working with that data for it to be an array, because what I need to be able to do is just easily chuck a new user in or update an existing user so that I don't have to worry about checking what's in the array and sorting it all out and all that stuff when I'm just adding a user. So every time they do an edit, I'm doing an update. So I want that to be quite fast and efficient. So this data structure is quite a fast way of doing that. All I have to do is do a lookup on the key, push the user in there, and then push it into the database. And that's good. But in my template, I need to work with an array of users because you can't really iterate properties so easily on a template. So I'd rather iterate an array with an each function in the template. So how do I convert this sort of list of objects into an array? Well, I can just write a little function to do it. So let's knock up a template helper function that does precisely that. So I'm in the isClient block, and isClient ... And so I do template dot editing users dot helpers, and it's going to be called users, and it's a function, and there it is. That's wrong. So function, and it goes like that. Okay, so it's a function, and at some point it should return some users. So I'll create a variable called users, and I'll return users at the end. Okay, so that's the basic thing. But now I need to figure out how to turn this into an array. So how do I do that? Well, I can essentially, well, before I do that, I need to pull in a document and pull in an eUsers object, but and then we'll turn it into an array. So let's create document eUsers, and then doc equals documents find one. We've only got one document, remember, at the moment, and so we will change this code later when we add extra functionality where we have more than one document. Anyway, so if there's no document, give up, just return, and then eUsers equals editing users dot find one, and this time I'm going to specify a filter, which is it has to match the document ID of the document I've just pulled out of the database. So I get the editing users for this document. Okay. Next step. Check if eUsers is any good. eUsers return. Again, give up. So basically no users, no doc, we give up. So now we should have a decent usable document and a decent usable set of users. And so we now need to convert that users sort of object into an array. So we use a for loop to iterate the keys on the object. For var user ID in eUsers dot in eUsers, right? So that will iterate all of the keys of eUsers, and I know that the eUsers dot users. All right. So what that's going to do is iterate the keys of this object here. At the moment, it only has one key, which is that, and that contains a user object. But as more users come on, you see that more things get added. So it's going to iterate each of those, and then I say users I. So, well, first of all, users equals new array. So I'm going to build my array in here. I'm going to set a counter to 0. So users I equals e-users, and then I pull out the user for that ID. So I'm basically saying, okay, iterate all of those user IDs, pull out this object, and then store that onto an array, and then add 1 to I. So next time round, I sort of move along one position in the array, and that should do it. So let's just check the errors. Okay, cool. I don't know if I'm actually calling that function yet though. So I then need to call the users. So each users and users. So remember, and each. Just put edit date in there for now. And so note that, I mean, inside the template, I'm trying to access something called users. So that will, of course, trigger the helper function I've just written called users. And hopefully, I should see some edit dates appearing. Okay. No, it looks like it's not quite working yet. Editing users. Let's see if we can find the problem. And that's good. So let's just put some printing out here so we can just check what's going in. Adding a user, and then we can just print out the user. Okay. Okay, so it's adding a user there. There it is, that's me being added. And the only problem is it's not currently displaying anything because the user is called last edit, and I've put in edit date. Last edit, did anyone spot that? Last edit, there we go. Go back in there. So there it is, there's the first user. And if I was to log in again as another user, you can see that I'm already logged in, look, as a test2, and then now I've got two dates appearing there. So that's my reactive data there. So it detected that the editing users object had changed, and it reran the helper function and re-rendered the template. Perfect. Final step is maybe I actually want to just show the full name. Oh, sorry, first name. Okay, oh, I've got a nasty error now. And I'll tell you why that is, because actually in Spacebar's templates, you cannot have keys that have hyphens in. It does not like it, so you have to do something about that. And I've got a little function which helps there, which is the final stage. So we grab that function, whack it in the module at the bottom, so I can access it. Okay, and it's called fix object keys. And all I have to do is pass in the object which has the keys with the hyphens in, and it will basically create a new object with keys without hyphens in, and then it should all work. So you can look at that code at your leisure, and I'm just going to pull that back there. So now it doesn't have a hyphen in, and hey presto, so now the two usernames are displayed, Matthew and user3. There we have it. We've now built a template which can reactively display the list of users who are currently editing a given document, and it uses that editing users object we specified in the previous lesson, but has to do some complex processing to just turn it into an array so that it can be easily displayed in the template. So it's always a good idea to make your template code as simple as possible, and if there's any complex stuff you need to do, just do it in the template helpers. Welcome to the first lesson in this module. What we're going to do in this lesson is add some more functionality to the editor, as you might imagine, and what we're going to add is the ability for users to create new documents. So far we've just been editing a single document, and everyone who uses the page has had to edit the same document. So it's obviously really useful to be able to have lots of different documents and choose which one you want to edit. So first of all, let's have a quick look at the wireframe that we're going to use to do that, because the first step which we're going to complete in this lesson is adding a simple button to the navigation bar which then calls an event listener defined on the template. Alright, so here's the wireframe, and you can see I've got all the bits that are on my site. I haven't put the login button, but you've got the brand, then the new thing I'm going to add, which is this new button, and then a list of editors, editor and preview. So it's all there. So that shows me where I'm going to add my button to create new documents. And what I want to do first is get that navigation bar and take it from just being static code sitting in the body tag, and I'm going to move it into a template so that it's much easier for me to assign events and helpers to it. So here's the HTML page where the templates are defined, and I'm going to grab the code from the navigation bar, take it out of the body tag and drop it down here. I'll put it above the templates because you know, in terms of the layout, it does actually appear at the top of the other templates. And the name is going to be navbar, and that's no problem. And there's the navigation code, and then I just have to drop it in to the body like that, save. So with a bit of luck, if my app is running, that's good. If I now look at it, it should look exactly as it did before. Perfect. But what I'm going to do now is add some more code to that navigation bar so that we can have a plus button. And I was thinking it might be quite nice to have a sort of little icon for that plus sign instead of maybe typing in a plus sign. And again, Bootstrap has a set of icons that it comes with which we can use for doing that. And if we go to the Bootstrap components page, you can see that these are all the available icons. And the one I'm going to use, although there's all these fun ones there and you can kind of use your own one, I'm just going to use the plus sign. So this one here. Okay, so how do we use them? Well, we scroll down below and it should give us a bit of boilerplate code that we can just pop in there. And there's a few caveats there that's worth making yourself aware of. But the basic idea is we can grab it like that and then pop it into the navigation bar template, and it's going to be next to the brand. And in case I want to add more buttons later, I'm actually going to make it part of a little functional nav bar there, and in a list item. So I don't know if you remember back in the second course, if you took it, we did some videos on accessibility, and we sort of tried to look at a web page with a screen reader, and we found out that if you structure your page properly, then it's much easier for people to read your page if they don't have full vision or something like that, and they have to get a machine to read the page to them. And an example of good structure is using list elements in your HTML to sort of write lists of links and lists of functions. And because I'm adding a function where it's going to be a button they can click on, I'm going to put it in a list. So here I've got my list element, and I've pasted in that boilerplate code from that makes the icon. The icon I want is called plus, and the class of this is navbar nav. Okay. Let's just see how that looks. Okay, and finally, I think I'm going to make it into a link. And put a blank. Oops. Okay, so I've just created the correct structure to add a plus icon, and then I'm going to make just a comment to say new doc. Well, we call it a document. Whoops. So that's appeared in the wrong place. Let's put that inside the A tag. Right, so let's just sort of lay out this code a bit more neatly so it's really obvious what's going on. So I've got a span, then I've got some text, and then I've got the end of the A and the end of the L, right? So that's really clear now. So basically I've got a UL, inside that I've got an LI and a link, which starts with the icon and then has some text. So let's have a look at that. Okay, you see how that looks? So I've got a nice plus sign and then a new document. And the final thing is to add a special class to the link so that it can be hooked into an event listener on the template. So let's put that in. So we put a class in there, JS add doc, right? So that would be something that I can bind an event listener onto. And I do that in my helper, event listeners. So let's just try and organize this a little bit. So these are all helpers, and then I'm going to put some events. So I'll label it up to say events. Now later in this module we're going to go back through this code and sort of reorganize it into folders and make it much more clear. At the moment we'll stick with this big monolithic file. So I do template, then the name of the template, which is navbar events, and I pass it a property set, and I have to say what type of event and then the class of things that I want to bind it to, and event prevent default, right, and then console log add a new doc. Okay, just to check that it's working. So let's just check that code again in case we've forgotten how to do events. So template, navbar, the name of the template, and we're adding events, and we're saying when someone clicks on anything in that template with the class of JS add doc, I want you to call this function, passing it the data about the event. And if we just double check that, so here we are, there is the navbar template, there is the A tag with the class. So basically it's binding an event listener to that A tag, which will trigger, and let's just save that one. Hopefully it'll give us a little reload, and then you can see in the console there it's printing out add a new doc. So I've successfully added a nicely formatted add button to my navigation bar, and I have hooked an event listener onto that so that I can then respond to the user's request to add a document. And in the next lesson we're going to sort of continue building out on that and sort of see how we can then actually create a document in the database when they click that button. Right, so we've done lots of hard technical work there, really making the collaborative code editor into something which kind of really is a bit more engaging and have multi-users and everything else. But what I want to do now is kind of have a look at what we've done and maybe tweak the user interface a little bit in various places, just to sort of improve the look and feel of it somewhat. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually install a theme, because I want it to be really clear that when people go to the page, that is a code editor. So what is the classic look and feel of a code editor? Well, if you look at my Sublime text editor here, you can see, you basically got black background, line numbers, and coloured text. So let's see if we can install some themes into the code mirror editor, which make it look a little bit more like this. And to do that, what we're going to do is look at the theme demo for Code Mirror. And Code Mirror, which is, remember, the Share.js library that we're using, we added an extra plugin called the Code Mirror plugin, which gives us access to this sort of fancy Code Mirror editor. There's also another editor we can use called Ace, but we're going to focus on Code Mirror. And Code Mirror has a set of themes built into the library, which we can see. So if we look at this theme demo page, you can see there's all kinds of different colours there that you can apply. And for me, I quite like the Cobalt theme. Well, Dracula is obviously quite appealing because of the name, but I quite like Cobalt. The Cobalt theme sort of looks pretty clear and has a fairly nice background color there. So let's see if we can install the Cobalt theme. Now the problem is with that Meteor package, we don't actually get all the themes because it's kind of stripped down to give you maybe a more minimal version of CodeMirror. So to get access to those themes, we need to go and grab the CodeMirror code, and that's on GitHub. So here's the GitHub page for the CodeMirror library, and if you go in there, you'll see there's a folder in the code called theme. So let's just download that code by hitting the download zip button there. And that will give us the whole of the CodeMirror library. We don't need the whole thing, we just need the themes. And once that's downloaded, I get a zip file. And there it is. And inside the zip file is all of the code for that. And what I want to do is basically add those themes to my application. So I'm in my application folder here. Because I only need to send this to the client, the server doesn't need to know about all these themes because it's not rendering any HTML like the client is. So I just go into this client folder, which is stuff that only gets sent to the client, and back over here, grab the theme folder, pop it in there. And you know, at the moment I've got all of the themes in there, which means that I'm going to be just sending all of those themes, which is probably a bit of an inefficient way to do it. So I can actually just go in there and delete everything except for Cobalt for now, because that's the one I want to use. And then if I want to use another one, I can add it in later. So that's my theme put into my folder. So remember that what will happen is Meteor will go and sort of mash all the CSS files together and create a single CSS file. And so how do I get access to that theme? Well, I have to go into the bit where I configure the editor, which is the config helper for the editor template. So there's the config helper, and I just have to run another line here, editor set option, and I set the theme option, and the option is going to be set to Cobalt. So I save that, and with a bit of luck, what will happen is my editor will take on a new style. Right, there we go. So the editor now has the Cobalt theme. Okay, so it's starting to look a little bit more obvious that we've got an editor on the left there. So now we're going to do a little bit of work on the preview window. So let's see. Now you can experiment with CSS, remember, by just popping up the console there, selecting the element you want to experiment with, and then so I'm going to experiment in this case with the iframe. So remember that preview is all sitting inside an iframe, and I can just go in here and start adding some styles. So if I don't like that border with the different things, it just looks like a sort of unstyled element on my page. So I'm going to simply set the border to 1 pix solid grey for now. And I think that looks a bit neater. And then I'd also, because it's a preview window, people might want to change the size. So I'm going to enable resizing. Resize. Okay, and finally I want it to expand to take up the full width of that column, because remember we've got 2 columns, one taking up half of the grid each. But it's not taking up all of that column at the moment, it's just kind of got its default size. So I'm going to resize it to width 100%. Right, so now my preview window looks a bit neater, but that's only a temporary change because I'm just experimenting in the browser there. But you can see it's kind of, I can line that up with the editor there, and it's a lot easier. So how do we apply those changes more permanently? Well, we have to go into the CSS file and just reconfigure the iframe element, or we could be more specific. That'll restyle any iframe elements that we use. But if we want to be really specific and just restyle this one, we could just do viewer iframe. So that would be viewer iframe. So the element with the ID viewer iframe is going to be restyled. So we did border 1 pix solid grey. We did resize both, and width 100%. Okay, and then when that reloads, hopefully it should sort of have those new styles more permanently. So it's just a reload there. There we go. So I've restyled that. One last thing I want to do is just restyle this bit up here where I've got my usernames of all the users who are editing the document. And the thing I'm going to use for that is called a Bootstrap label. Bootstrap labels are quite nice because they offer you default set of different colors for labeling things. And so I'm going to set these to green because it's kind of a happy color and means success. So that's good. So I just grab that boilerplate code, go into my template and drop it in there in the editing user template. And I can then put the text inside the span like this. And it should take on that style. Good, so that you can see it's got the green label now. And finally, I'm just going to make it really clear that this is a set of editing users, editors. Okay, so it's just going to say editors there. So there we have it. So now every time a new editor pops up, that their name will appear on there, and it'll be kind of clearer what's going on. So there we go. So we made sort of three sort of main changes there to the user interface. We've restyled the text editor window, the code mirror window, and we have restyled the preview window, and we've restyled the list of editing users. Right, so we've now got a button on the navigation bar and an event listener which listens for people clicking on that button. The next step is to actually go ahead and create an entry in the database when they click on the button. So let's see how we can do that. So here is the event listener, and at the moment it just prints out that it's going to add a new document. What I want to do though is firstly only allow people who are logged in to create documents, but I'm still going to show them the add button to everyone, so everyone can see the add button, but only when you actually log in does it do anything. So the reason for that is that it's nice to kind of sort of tempt people with functionality, so you can say, well, possibly you'll be able to add documents, but then when they hit it, you tell them, oh right, yeah, you need to log in or create an account. So that kind of encourage them to do that. So let's just do that now. So if not meteor.user, user not available, then alert, you need to log in first. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and do it. They are logged in. Let's insert a doc. Okay, let's just save that, check that it works. I'm logged in at the moment, so I'm going to log out just so I can test that button. Okay, good. So you need to log in first. Now, an alert is the pretty rudimentary way of communicating with users, but in this case, it's okay. But maybe you'd actually use some sort of Bootstrap modal or something a bit neater and nicer. But for now, this is just minimal code to just prompt them to log in the case where they haven't yet. Okay, so I'm going to log in and see if that goes away. Test. Oops. Right, and I'm logged in. So now you can see it's no longer giving me the alert. So that's good. So that logic works. And what I want to do now is insert something into the database. Now you might remember from the previous module that actually we're no longer just doing inserts right there wherever we want. We've now constrained where it is that inserts happen to just those Meteor methods. So in order to do an insert now, we need to define a method which allows us to do an insert. And the reason being that we can then do whatever checks we need to again. So we're kind of going to have two layers of checks. The first layer of checks is like client side, and it just checks if they're logged in and just prompts them to log in. And then we're going to do a server side check as well to check if they're logged in, because they might be able to circumvent our client side checks. So the client side check is really for friendliness to make it usable. The server side check is for security. So we've done the client side check, that's this. And so the server side is to push it through a method. Okay, so all we have to do is do Meteor call, and I'm going to say call the method add doc. Okay, but I haven't actually defined that method yet. So if I go down here into where I'm defining all my methods, add doc, function, Make sure you put a comma, or you might get some weird errors about Y's not being in the right places. Okay, so comma after your things in a property set. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to construct a document object which I want to place into the database. So it's going to be just a simple thing with a title and an attached user and a creation date. So here we go, var doc. But before I do all of that, I'm going to check if the user's logged in. So if not this.userid, so we use a different technique inside the method to check if they're logged in. This.userid, no, not logged in. Then I'm just going to return. Just give up. Don't do anything if they're not logged in. Otherwise, great, logged in. Let's go ahead. So doc equals, and I'm going to build my document right here. And it's going to have an owner field, which is going to be this.userid. And it's going to have a created on field, which is going to be just a date object representing today, and maybe a sort of starter title, which is going to be my new doc. Now maybe when they hit the add button, you know, you could prompt them to type in a title or whatever you want to do, but for now we're just going to set a default title because it's less code. Okay, so that's the document. Now I need to insert it into the database. So I do documents, insert, and just doc. Okay, and that's fine because once I'm in a method, I can do inserts as I like. I don't have to worry about you know, being allowed to do them. If I'm in a method, it means I am allowed to do kind of anything on there. And so the point is that I should do my checks here before I do an insert. So that's all I'm doing. All I need to do is check if they're logged in. So they can create as many documents as they like, as long as they're logged in. So that's the basic code. And let's just see if it's working. And what should happen is whenever I hit this button here, it says add a new doc in the console. And if I go into my Mongo shell, so Mongo shell, remember, allows us to just look at the raw data in the database. And I go into my Meteor application folder and type Meteor Mongo. And I'm going to just say show collect. Let's just have a little look at the collections. Okay, documents. So I'm going to db documents, find count. How many documents do I have? Got 14. Obviously been playing around with this a bit. Click it a few more times. It goes up to 19. Right, so the number of documents is going up. That's good. Final step, let's just see okay, what the documents actually look like. So I did find pretty, which will basically find a set of documents and then lay them out nicely so I can read them. And there it is. I've got my user ID, I've got my date, and I've got my title. So the documents are going into the database correctly. And so we're going to stop there. And in the next lesson, we're going to see how we can then automatically load that new document when the user creates it. But for now, that's it. We've hooked up that button, we're putting things into the database, and we're ready to do the next step. Right, so we've got new documents going into the database, and that's great. But what we want to do now is to be able to actually load that new document into the editing window so we can edit the new thing we just created. And we're going to have to sort of rework the code. So in this lesson, we're going to rework the code a bit so that we're able to work with multiple documents. Because if you look at this visualization here, you can see how we're working at the moment. We've basically got a single document, and lots of people can kind of come in and access that document. But the problem is, if there's another document, the code that we have is not going to work. So if we've got a situation like this, where we've got, say, 3 documents and different users looking at each document, we have no way of doing that, because what we're doing to access the document is just calling find one and just pulling out the first document from the database, and everybody's using that. So if we want to have sort of specific documents, we're going to have to change the code a bit. So what we're going to use is this thing called session. So if you look at this visualization here, it kind of shows you where the data is. And the idea is that, say we've got 3 documents, and each person who's using our system has their own instance of session. So you can see we've got, you know, a session under every user there. And so the session is, if you like, a bit of local data that we store for each user, which is not in the database. It's just a temporary bit of data, and it allows us to remember sort of what's going on with that user currently. Okay, and what we're going to use it for is to remember which document they're currently looking at. So instead of just always giving them the first document that comes out of the database, we're going to remember which document they want by storing the ID in the session. And the session is basically a key store that allows us to put different simple variables in, which we can edit and change. And the really important thing about session is that it's reactive. And we're going to see what that means in a minute when we dive into the code. So let's get started. So I'm opening my app folder. Let's rerun the app. And so I'll go straight into the JS file and show you what I mean by having this single document problem. So you can see here, this is the helper function, which tells the user, gives the user a document. It tells the whole editing system which document we're going to load. And you can see we're just calling documents find one. We're not finding a specific document. So we have no way of specifying which document we're loading. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a helper function, if you like, well, not really a template helper, but my own helper function, which will set up the session, make sure the session is ready to go if possible. Okay, so I'm going to call it setup current document. So it means if someone hits the page for the first time, it gets kind of initialized to whatever document we can find for them. But later on, we're going to see how it gets set to the appropriate document. And then I'm simply going to return session get doc ID, and I don't need all this code anymore. Right, and so where am I going to write this function? Well, I'm just going to stick it down at the bottom here with the other function I wrote. Remember the function which removes the hyphens from the key names which I had to write? Well, I just put it with that one, and it's a function. And what it's going to do is basically have a variable called doc, and if the session, if not session get doc ID, no doc ID set yet, then I want you to update the session. So doc equals documents, find one. So here's where I just grab any old one. So if I haven't found one yet, if I haven't got one and bound to the session, we just find any old one. And if it looks good, then session set doc ID to doc ID, right? So that bit of code is going to get run whenever we try and access the doc ID on the template. In other words, the first time the page loads and they try and view a document. And so let's just do that, see if that's working. And so, basically the second time the template renders or something like that, it will call this, but it will say, okay, well, someone else has taken over from dealing with the session, which we're going to do in a minute. Someone else has taken over, it's already been set, or even I've set it previously, so I don't need to do it. So let's see if that works. Okay, so we should be able to edit the document. Yeah, that seems to work. And if I go over to another browser, I should also be able to edit the document there. Okay, so that's good. So the reactive text editing is still working, brilliant, no problem. What's nice is actually my template helper function is now trimmed down a bit and it's a lot simpler. And so the reactive thing, I mentioned I was going to come to that. The point is, if at any point the session changes, so the document ID changes on the session, then this template will re-render. So when's that going to happen? Well, for example, if we've created a new document and we want to trigger a change to the document, the session document ID, then we can trigger an automatic re-render of that template, which depends upon it. And that's what we're going to do in the next lesson. But for now, we've switched over to this sort of arrangement here, where we're remembering which document they're editing by storing it on the session. And so in the next lesson, we're going to sort of develop that further. The final step in this adding a new document process is to load the document into the editor. So we've kind of reconfigured the code a bit so that it can work with this session-based document IDs. And so what we need to do now is update the session ID with the new document ID, and hopefully that should re-trigger the editing window to sort of re-render, and it should update to the newest document. So let's see if that works. So I need to go into my event function here. So here's where I'm creating a new document when I call meteor add doc. And what I'd like to do is somehow get the ID back. So when it's created that document, I want to receive the ID. So let's dive into the method there and say var ID equals console log ID add doc. Let's just put some prefixes in so we know where the printout's coming from. Add doc method got an ID, and we'll put ID, and then we return the ID from the method. Okay, so that's step one, is just sort of when you call insert on a collection, you should get back an ID, and so we're just going to print that out to check that's working. And whoops, rerun, oops, go into the app window, rerun it. Reload. Okay, so add. I need to log in. I might not have an account. Test.com. Okay. Try again. So my own security is stopping me from doing stuff, which is how it should be, but it's a bit annoying. Okay, so that's the method printing out an ID, and then it should be, according to the code, returning that ID. So where does that ID go? Well, there's the call. There it is. We're calling it there. So maybe we can do var ID equals meteor call add doc, and I can just say console log event got an ID back, and then there's the ID. Okay, let's try that. So basically when the event listener gets that ID back from the method, I just print it out. That doesn't look good. So I've got the ID coming through in the method, but then when it gets it back, it turns into an undefined, and I can't use an undefined. I need a proper ID so I can tell the editor which one to load. So there's a problem there, and I'll tell you what the problem is. The problem is that we're dealing with asynchronous code here. And what does that mean? It means that some of the code in Meteor actually, when you call something like a method, it actually fires off and runs in the background whilst your program continues running in the foreground, if you like. And then eventually the method sort of finishes, and then it calls the return and gives you back the data. And that's really tricky because that isn't sort of procedural programming as we know it. That's asynchronous programming. So how do we get that ID back? And just to sort of really demonstrate that, I'd like to just say, well, we can specify a callback for the method. So when it's finished doing its work in the method, it should call this function for us. So here's the callback. I pass it in. When I make the call to the method, I pass in a callback, and the callback will be sent an error message if there is one, or an error object rather, and then the result, whatever the method returns, will be sent back as res. So we go if not error, so everything worked, all good. Then console log event got a callback received ID, and then we can put res there. So have a little think. Which one do you think of these two lines is going to go first? Is it going to be event callback received or event got an ID back? Well, let's see what happens. So we got event got an ID back, undefined, event callback received ID. So what's going first? So first, that line that's highlighted there, that's running first, and then it's running that line. And that's precisely asynchronous programming, the idea that the sort of method takes some time to run and then it calls the callback. Meantime, our code's carried on and it's just run the next line straight away. And so this line, this call to Meteor call does not block execution. Execution carries on. Eventually that function gets called right there, and that's your anonymous function right there. So we don't need this anymore. So what we do is we just do our processing here. And what we need to do is update the ID on the session, right? So we just say session set and doc ID to the new ID. So the ID that we just got back from the method. So that'll tell the session, right now we're not editing the old document anymore, we're editing the one that we've just created. So to do save, and with a bit of luck, there won't be any errors, and I hit that button and I get a new editor window. Did you see that? So this is a new file, right? Hit it again, boom, I'm into a new document again. But if I just hit the page for the first time, I should sort of get whatever comes back from find one. So I just did a reload there and it gives me sort of the basic, that hello thing. And again, if I'm on another browser window over here and I reload, yeah, that should give me whatever the default one is that comes back from find one, because that's what happens first. And then again, well, I'm not logged in, so I can't create one there. But yeah, so that's the idea. We've now successfully added a link to the navbar, which triggers the insertion of a document into the database and using a method call. And then we've created a callback so that when that method is completed and we've got the new document ID, we then use that to update the session so that we now are editing a different document. And that triggers this reactive process which reloads the editor window and we're now editing our new document. Okay, so that's brilliant. We've completed the whole process of adding a new document. And you might be thinking, well, where are all those documents? Where have they all gone? And I mean, of course, we can find them with Meteor Mongo in the shell, but how do we expose those documents in the interface? And that's what we're going to do in the next lesson. So we've completed the implementation of the sort of adding document functionality, but now we need to make it possible for the user to actually access those documents as and when they please. Because obviously as they've added a bunch of documents, we now need to show them all the documents that are in the database that they can access. So what we're going to do is just start by adding a list of documents to the navigation bar so they can quickly jump in. And later in the course, I think we're going to sort of come up with a more elaborate design for that. But we'll start with just a simple drop-down list. So the first thing is to add some stuff to the navigation bar template. And I'm going to sort of see if I can put my drop-down list in there. So I think it can just become part of this other navigation list because we've already got a navigation list for adding a document, so we'll just add the list of documents as another element to that. And I'm going to use some Bootstrap boilerplate code for that. So I'll show you where I'm going to get it from. If I just go to the Bootstrap components page here, whoops, then we can see we've got, we go to navbar down there. There's a nice kind of drop-down feature here, which I like. And I'm going to grab the boilerplate code for that drop-down. Instead of sort of having a drop-down looks like that, I'm going to have a drop-down list of documents. So let's see how we can do that. So I'm going to look for that code in here and just grab it. There it is. Drop-down, and I get down to the second list. Okay, right. So I'm going to just pop that in to the template there. Let's put some comments in before we do it. Drop-down list. And drop down list. So before I paste it in, I've got some placeholder, marker things in there, right? So just tab that in, and then so this, if you like, it's just another list. So you've got a list element there, which is your add document, and then you've got another list element here, which is going to be a drop-down list. And so let's just lay it out a bit nicer. So the first thing is this drop-down thing here. So I'm just going to space that out a bit so it's nicer to look at. I don't want it to say drop down, I want it to say documents, and we can leave that there. And then I've got the list, which is going to be actually dynamically generated from data. So we'll just put doc1 there for now, just to see if it works. And I go back over to my application folder, run the application, back into the app, which is over here, reload, and now I've got, you see a little drop down on my navigation there. Okay, so I've sort of added the HTML code to give me a basic drop down, and the next step is to sort of put some content into there, right? And so we need a template helper, which is going to pass the template a list of documents. So what I'll do is I'll say put each of documents. So documents will pull on the template helper, and end of each, and this is just going to be the title of the document. Title, like that. And next I need to specify this helper function on the navbar template, so it can access that data. So I should have some stuff about the navbar here. Oh, no helpers yet. So we've got some events for the navbar, but no helpers. So I'll just jump in here and put it in. And template navbar dot helpers, and it's called documents. And what it does is pass back all documents for now. Return documents.find with an empty filter, so it should return all of the documents. Right, let's see if that works. Okay, so there's currently one document in there. So if I hit that button, whoops, it says I'm not logged in. So let's log in quickly. Test. Create the account. So I need to just quickly create an account, and then I should now have the ability to add documents. So you see, every time if I tap that add document button, so I did it 4 times, so now you see all those documents have appeared down here. So that's great, but the next step is when I click on an element in that list, I want to be able to load that document into the editor. So we already implemented the code whereby, you know, every time we create a new document, it automatically loads it into the editor. But I now want to sort of load a document when I want to, based on what I click on in that list. So we go back into the template, and we set the class on the link. So ahref here, class equals JS load doc. Then I need to specify that event in the template helper. Sorry, the template events. So I've already got some events here for that navbar, and it's called click, and click on JS load doc. Okay, so when they click on something with the class of JS load doc, do this. Basically, event. And I should be able to, from the context of this, so in an event, you know, so we've dealt with sort of standalone events that don't really need to know what was clicked on, particularly in terms of like lists of things. So I'll just show you that if I print out console log this, you'll see that in the this variable I've got access to the context, the data context that this event occurred in. So the data context is basically, you know, is going to be a document, because there's my iteration through the document. So it's going to go through, and each time that link gets generated, it's accessing a document object, right? So the data context is a document. Therefore, I expect this, when I print out this, to look like some sort of document object. So let's just see how that looks. So when I click on this, I should print out something that looks like a document. And that's what we expect. We expect it to have an ID, a created on field, an owner, and a title, as you can see. That's what we would see if we looked at that the documents in the Mongo database. So it's basically the raw data that represents a document. So what I want to do is actually take this ID field and use it to load a document. It's quite simple. Because we're using that reactive session stuff, just grab this code from up here, and instead of res, it's going to be this.id. So it basically takes the ID of the document that you clicked on and uses it to update the session, which should trigger a sort of reactive response to that in the Meteor, and basically it will re-render the editor with the new document. Fingers crossed. Okay, so let's just see. So I'm going to write some code in there so we can see doc1, okay, and then doc2, and then doc3, right? So I've just put some code in so we know if we're loading it. So you see that when I load doc1, I get the doc1 code, doc2, I get the doc2 code, doc3, I get the doc3 code. Okay, so you can see it's kind of loading the different documents, depending which one I click on. Okay, that's great. I've got my list of documents and I can load different documents as I please, but the problem is they've all got the same title, so it's not really clear what's going on. So a nice feature I'm going to quickly add is to make the title editable, and we're going to do that by using a package which makes it very easy to make editable text fields. So the first step is to display the title, and I'm going to do that by adding a new template, and it's going to look a bit like this. So it's going to appear above the list of editing users, and it's going to be called doc meta. And I call it doc meta because it's sort of metadata about the document. In other words, information about the document. Or I could call it doc info, whatever. But doc meta is a bit more webby, right? So let's grab the editing users template and copy that. Doc meta. And I don't need any of that stuff, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a span in there and set the class to h1 because I want it to be a heading, but I don't want to have all the extra padding you get with a heading. And I'm going to say this is the title, just to check that my template's working as I'd expect. Okay, so now the title, you can see, is appearing above the sort of information about who's editing it. So that's cool. Next step is I need to make that title be the actual document title. So there I say title, but where's it going to get that data from, right? Remember, each template has to have its own data that you pass to it. And what we can do is we can sort of request some data that we want to display by using the with function. And with, which is like that. And with, I'm going to say document. So in other words, call the helper function document, and then whatever that passes back, we then run down here and plot and draw it out. So I need to write that helper function. So it's template doc meta helpers, and then like that, and it's called document. And it says it's going to return the current document, which is documents.find1, and the ID is going to have to match whatever the session ID is. Session get doc ID, right? So I basically use the whatever the session ID document, which, remember, when I click on a link in the list, I update the session ID, the session doc ID to be that. So the idea is that this is using that as well, just to send back the current document. And with a bit of luck, we can save that, reload, and get some nasty errors. Let's have a look. Type error, document find one is not a function. That's right, because document is called documents. That's the name of the collection, not document. So wait for a sec. Ah, brilliant. Right, so now we've got the correct title. So if we go to my new document or my new doc, you can see the title is updating as we'd expect based on the title of the actual document. Final step is to make that editable. And we're going to do that by adding a library. And I've sort of prepared the name of the library in my clipboard there. It's called B. Abrahams Editable Text. So thanks, B. Abrahams. And you just install it like that, and there's a couple of things we need to do. So it provides us with, as often these packages do, packages or libraries, they provide us with a sort of template we can use. And I've got a little bit of boilerplate text here to make it a little bit easier to make sure I get it right. And I jump into the template, and basically instead of just displaying the title there, I drop in this special template. So the template that the package has provided me is called editable text, and I just need to tell it what the sort of Mongo name of the collection is, because it does all the editing in the background for me without me worrying, and I need to tell it which field I want to be editable. Okay, so we save that, and then restart the server, wait for the server to boot up, hit reload, and then we should be in business. Now, can I click on it? So you click on it, and then now I can edit the title. And I press enter, and we'll see that the title has been updated in that responsive list as well, so reactive list. Another one. Okay, and you see that's been updated now as well. So that means the data is being updated because you can see I'm editing it in the text field, and then it's updating in that list. So that was pretty easy, right? But the final thing is, it's a bit worrying that actually if I go to this page like this, actually this naughty user, I can edit too. Okay, don't know why. Oh, I've got a bit of a layout problem on Safari. See, this is why you should test in different browsers. It looks like this login box is causing some problems. We'll worry about that later. But basically, I can, this user can edit, and I'm not even logged in. So I'm able to edit the title, naughty editor. Let's see if that happens. So you see over here, naughty editors appeared. So basically someone else is editing my documents. I don't want that. So actually, because editable text operates in the background, and we need to do it in the editable text way, we need to set our security. So what we can do is it provides a special helper function which we have to implement, which it calls in order to test whether it's allowed to edit or not. And so that helper function is called user can edit. And I've actually written one here that should do the job. And I'm going to just drop that into the helper functions there. So notice I'm binding it to the editable text template, which is the special template that was given to us by the package. And it has to be called user can edit. And so what I've got here is basically some code which basically checks if the current document also has the same ID as the current user, right? So it has the owner ID of the current user. So in other words, does the current user own the currently edited document? So, and if they can, then we return, if they do, then we return true, otherwise return false. So basically they're only allowed to change the title if they own the document and if they're already sort of looking at it. Okay, so now I should be able to change, this user should be able to edit. Oops. Yeah. Well, obviously I don't own that document, so let's try and create one that I do own. I own this because I just added it, okay? But over here, if I go to I own this, hopefully, yeah, you see I now click on it and I can't edit. It won't let me edit. So you can see that what's happened there is it's calling that function and it's returning false for the anonymous user, so they don't own it, so they're not allowed to edit. And it's returning true for my user that's logged in because I own it, so therefore I can edit the title. But both of them can edit the text happily. Okay, so what we've done there is sort of implemented some basic stuff where the user can access their list of documents and load them up and then edit the title. In the next lesson, we're going to add one more sort of characteristic to the document where the documents can be private or not. And then I'm going to show you a new Meteor technique which makes that work really well, which is called subscribe and publish. So I'll see you in the next lesson. Right, so now we can access whichever documents we want, and we can change the titles if we're the owner, and we can create new documents. But the next step is to add a bit of extra security for the user so they can select whether a document is private or public. And if it's private, it's going to appear only in their list of documents, and if it's public, it appears in everyone's list. So the way we're going to do it is by adding a simple checkbox to the user interface which allows them to check whether it's public or private. And we'll use a bootstrap component to do that. So first of all, I'm on the bootstrap CSS page here, which has all the sort of simplest types of constructs that you can use in Bootstrap. So there's the forms on the right hand side there, gives me this checkbox. That's the thing I'm interested in. So where's the code? Right there. So I grab that code and I'm going to put this checkbox into the template code into doc meta. So there's my doc meta template being embedded there. So I roll down, and there's the, oops, just let's make it a bit more compact. There it is. There's my doc meta template, and what I want to do is inside this same data context, I'm going to drop in a checkbox, which basically says private. Okay, and let's just see how that looks in the interface. So it gives me a little private checkbox under there, which is great. And then I need to connect an event listener to it. So I need to put a special class on the checkbox and then figure out how I can deal with the event back in the JavaScript. So first of all, add the special class, and it goes here, class equals JS tog, let's just say, yeah, tog private, as in toggling that field there. And then I go back into my JS and I'm going to write a new event listener on the doc meta template. So template doc meta events. After you've done a bit of this, you get reasonably fluent with sort of writing all this stuff, especially if you use a nice text editor like this one. And the event is a click on JS toggle. Don't forget the full stop. And it's a function which receives an event. And first of all, let's just do console log. Now I happen to know that you can get the state of the checkbox by calling event.target.checked. So event.target gives me access to the thing that actually they clicked on or whatever is related to the event. So the bit of the web page. So in this case, that's a checkbox. And checked is a property that checkboxes have, which is either true or false, depending what state they're in. So let's just see if we see the correct state of the checkbox there. So I click on it, it's now checked, and true is being printed out. Click on it again, it's now false. False is being printed out. My next step is to take that information and use it to update the document, so to set a private flag on it to true or false. And so I do that by calling a method. Now remember that we're no longer just doing inserts and updates wherever we want in our code. We have to do it through a method, and that's more secure. So I'm going to say Meteor. Well, first of all, I want to know what my document ID is, and so I'll create I'm going to create a little object which I'm going to send to the method, which tells it what I want to do. And the object is going to look like this: var doc equals and the document ID. So I'm going to set an ID on the document to the session get doc ID. So it's always going to be the current document that's being edited. So I can only toggle private, public on the current document. Even though I could access the real document that's embedded in the template or whatever, I'm going to force it to be the currently edited document. And I'm going to set a private field to, well, let's call it is private, to the value of the form there. So which is, as we saw earlier, true or false, right? So I'm going to create this document thing, and then I call Meteor method, and the method's going to be called update doc privacy, and I'm going to pass it in my doc there, okay? And then I need to write this method. So I'm just going to jump down to the bottom of the code there, and more or less where I'm writing my method. There's one of the methods, and the method is called update doc privacy, and so I'll put it in here, update doc privacy function as usual, and I'm going to let it receive a doc, and it's going to let's just log out the doc to make sure we're getting it okay into the method. And it's always good to check the data that's coming into your functions before you kind of think, oh, it's all gone horribly wrong. It's always good to check what you're working with. So I'll say that I'm in the method and that I've got that. Okay, syntax error. What have I done wrong? I've forgotten the comma. Okay, Meteor method is not a function. That's right. So go back here. Because I don't call a method by calling Meteor method, I call it by saying Meteor call. Fair enough. Back in, reload. Let's toggle it. Okay, so I'm update privacy method and I'm receiving that object which I created. So that's good. So the method is receiving the correct data. So the final step is to actually do the update on the database, and I go into the method, back into the method, and say, so what I can do is I can pull out the document I want to update and then set that private field to what it should be. So I can do it like this: var real doc equals documents, find one where the ID equals doc.id. Okay, and if I've got a real doc, then real doc.is private is going to be set to doc.is private. And then I do documents.update, same filter, and pass it real doc. Okay, so this means that I sort of pass a really simple bit of data from the client side into the method, and the method does the work of kind of checking that, yeah, this document exists, and then it could also check if you're the owner, that kind of thing, so that other people can't toggle it. That's probably a good thing we should put in here. So we could, in fact, in find one, say owner is this dot user ID. There we go. So now it has to have the ID of the document they sent, and it has to be owned by the current user. So that's more secure. And then if we get a document, then go ahead, update the private field, and then store it back into the database. And so we'll just run this, see if we've got any problems. Okay, no errors. And if I go into the database with our old friend Meteor Mongo, oops, let's go into there, Meteor Mongo, here it is, and I do that. Okay, so all I've done is I've called DB documents find, so I'm printing out all of the documents I can, that's coming back. So you see private is set to true, right? So let's just check if that tallies with what I can see in the interface. So currently private is indeed set to true. So if I set it to false, then it should now be false. Right, that's correct, and nothing else has changed because I haven't allowed it to update any of the other fields. So it's kind of limiting what that method can do. It can only change the private field, and only if they own it. Okay, so that's cool. And the next step is to control which list of documents you can see based on whether they're public or private, and we'll do that in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to learn about another Meteor security feature, which is the counterpart to Meteor methods. Now, think about Meteor methods. What they do is they essentially allow you to control write access to the database. And that's good. You want to be controlling exactly when writes happen to the database. Publish and subscribe, this Meteor technique we're going to look at in this lesson, allows you to control read access to the database. In other words, control what the current connected client can see from your database. So it's really a counterpart to the methods. And we're going to use it to control whether people can see public or private documents from other people. So let's have a look at that now. So the first step is to actually remove one of the packages that comes with Meteor. And the package is called Auto Publish. Before I do it, I'm going to illustrate exactly why we need to remove Auto Publish. So we've implemented this feature that allows us to have public and private documents, right? So let me just create a few documents and set them to public and private, and then set the titles appropriately so it's fairly obvious what's going on. So I'm going to create some example data basically. Right, am I logged in? No. I think I'm going to have to create a new account. I've logged in, and now I can create a new document, and myk's private doc. Okay, and we'll set that to private. You'll see that's appearing in there. And create another one and say myk's public doc. That one I want to be public. Okay, so it should, I mean, it's not actually correctly showing that in the checkbox there, but there they are. And let's check them in the database. So pull out those documents. So you see myk's private doc is private is set to true. myk's public doc is private set to false. And okay, and so let's then go to our code and see if we can control what people see. So if we go back up to the template helpers, so documents is where we generate that list of documents that appears in the nav bar, and here's where we kind of, in the simplest case, control what can be seen. So let's say I say, okay, well, it's fine. I'm only going to show them documents that are not private. So is private is set to false. Okay, so only find things is private set to false. So that's secure, right? Because the user can't see anything that's not private. Oops, that is private, right? So that's see myk's private doc disappeared. So I'm now controlling it. I mean, technically, it should also show, show if you're the owner, it should show you your private docs. We'll deal with that in a minute. I'm just illustrating a point. So documents fine is private is false. Basically, filters down to only those documents that are public, basically, and that's good. I've now put a filter in there, so it's more secure, right? And the next step is to say, okay, what if I log in as another user over here? And what do I see on my list? Okay, great. So I'm an anonymous user. Well, in fact, what I'll do is I'll log in here as the MYK user. Okay, and then I'm now logged in as MYK, and over here I'm going to log out so we can look in the console. Right, so this one is logged out. This one is logged in. So the idea is that if I do meteor.user, okay, right, so I'm not getting any action on the users there. So this user should not be able to see that private document, but actually they can. Documents.find find one where is private is set to true. There we go, there's your private document. Oh dear, and I'm not logged in and I'm able to do it. And this is exactly the problem that we're trying to solve. That yes, in your client code you might only you might only filter it down to those that they can see, but effectively in the console they can behave like the client and they can run any of that code. So they can effectively write what you can write in your JS file is client block. So you're allowed to behave as the client in that console. So we need to think of a better way of doing it. And the better way of doing it is called the publish and subscribe model. And with publish and subscribe, what we do is we don't just publish everything. We state specific collections which are being published, and then we write functions which actually provide the appropriate set from that collection. So say I've got all the documents, and if I subscribe to that, I don't get all of the documents back, I just get the ones that I'm allowed to see. How do we do it? Well, we have to first of all remove the auto publish package. Meteor remove auto publish, like that. Right, and you will find that now if I rerun Meteor, reload, so now I can't see any documents, right? So that's a good starting point. I've now stopped anyone from being able to see anything, so I can't even see the default I can't load a document, I can't do anything. So I've now locked off all access to collections, and now I need to reinstate access, and that's right, so it's putting the control in your hands, so that you have to explicitly say, right, you're allowed to see this. And here's how we do it. We go into the we go into the the JavaScript code, and we can first of all look at our collection. So we've got two collections here, and what I want to do is in the client subscribe to those two collections. So Meteor subscribe, and I have to do this in the client code. I'm subscribing to documents. I'm subscribing to editing users. But that's not enough. I'm subscribed, but the server is not currently publishing them. So I can subscribe to whatever I like, but if the server doesn't publish it, it's no good. So I need to go back into my server code down here. So if Meteor is server, that's the startup code. And then here's some meteor.publish. And so I'm publishing documents, and this is a function that gets called when you want to access documents. So I'm only going to return a subset of the documents. So I could return anything here. I could just return one. It's up to me. Return documents dot find, and we'll say is private is set to false. Okay. So that means I can only see private documents. So let's try that. Right, so I'm back in business. I can see documents again. Let's see if we can do that trick again. No. Okay, so I can see documents where private is set to false. That's fine. I'm allowed to do that. But if I try and get into the private documents, I'm not allowed to anymore, because I'm only allowed to see whatever documents come back from that publish function. So there we go, I've implemented that, and I also need to write a publish function for the editing users. So we put that in there too. So it's going to be Meteor publish, whoops. I don't have to type anymore. Editing users function. And close function. Right, there's that, and then that's just going to return editing users.find, and that's fine. They can see all of that stuff, but I could limit that as well to only being able to see editing users on documents they have access to, or whatever it is. I can implement whatever filters I like, but I'm not worried about editing users. Okay, so there you go. I've now implemented subscribe and publish security, which controls how people can read documents in the database. Right, so I'm just going to make a few final little fixes to the code that we have to make sure it's all working nicely. And so the first thing I want to do is remove the filter that I had in my documents helper function, which was preventing that list of documents from showing what it should. Then I'm going to just fix up the, make sure the document list's got exactly what it should have in it by implementing an OR filter. And finally, I'm going to just make sure that checkbox flag is only being displayed to people who are allowed to mess with it. Okay. Number one, the filter on the helper. So let's go into the helper functions. Where are we? It is the documents list on the nav bar, this one. And you can see currently it says is private is false. So we don't need a filter on this one anymore, because it just should show whatever comes back from that subscription. So we save that. Great. And let's just check what's coming in. So I've currently got that, and MYK is public doc, which kind of makes sense because I'm logged in as MYK, but I should also be able to see MYK private doc. So why is that not there? Well, because it's private, therefore I'm not finding it. And so I'm going to go into the subscription definition. There we go. So there it is, and you can see that I'm just essentially just finding all the documents that are public. But I also want to show documents which the current user owns. And so I can actually use a slightly more elaborate filter to do that. And that is the OR filter. So it looks like this, $OR. And then it takes an array of objects, which are basically tests. And there's another one, there's the end. Okay, so or you can pass any number of sort of tests if you like, and if any of them are true, then it will pass the test. And the other test is owner is equal to, so either if private is false, in other words it's a public document, or owner is this user ID. So either if I own it or it's public, then it should appear in the list. Okay, so let's save that and check if it's operating correctly. Right, so now I'm logged in as this MYK user, and I've got the sort of starter document, I've got MYK's private doc, and I've got MYK's public doc. Okay, so that's sorted. Let's just check what happens if an anonymous user goes in there. What do they see? So this is an anonymous user, they're not signed in. And on there, let's just reload. So they've got MYK's public doc and the starter document. So that's right. So they're no longer seeing the private document. Only the owner sees it. Right. So that's good. The next thing is, if they do go into the public document, you can see they can toggle that private flag. I don't know if it's actually affecting the database. Let's check. There's a document. So let's see what happens. MYK's public doc is currently set to private false, and if I try and toggle it to private over here, it remains false. So my security that I implemented before is working, but still I don't want to show the person that checkbox because they might wonder why it's there, and you know, it's not doing anything basically. So we just need to put some logic in the template to check if the owner user is equal to the current user, and we can do that like this. I'm going into my template code now, and I'm going into the bit where the checkbox is, which is here. And basically, I can do if owner equal to current user. Okay, so if can edit, why not do it like that? And if, okay. Let's keep it simple. So I need a helper function called canEdit, and so I'm just going to jump in and do that now. Helper function on document meta. There it is. Right. CanEdit function. Basically, I'm going to get the document var doc equals if doc, then I'll do a test. So if doc, then if doc.owner is equivalent to Meteor user ID, then return true, right? Otherwise, I'm just going to return false right at the bottom, so I don't care what else happens. That's the only case where they're allowed to do it. And so I've now got an error, reference error, documents is not defined, of course not, because it's called documents. Let's wait for it to reload. Hopefully it should work now. And you can see that I don't appear to be the owner of this document, so I can't do anything to it. It should have disappeared there as well. And that's good. But if I load up one of my ones, you can see suddenly I've got the rights to toggle it, right? Even if it's public or private, it doesn't matter. But if I'm the anonymous user over here and I load up, say, MYK's public doc, I can't do anything with it. And that's fine. That's exactly what I want. So we've now essentially fixed up the filter on the document helper function, so it doesn't do any filtering. We're doing all the filtering in the subscribe bit now, and we have fixed up the subscription so it gives us things that we own or things which are public. And finally, we have sort of reconfigured that template a bit so it intelligently shows the private public flag, depending whether you're allowed to use it or not. And that's the end of the lesson. Welcome to the first lesson in this new module. What we're going to do now is a bit of housekeeping. It's a little bit dull, but it's a good point to do it because we've written a lot of code and we've got this great big JavaScript file that's full of all these different things. And what I want to do is show you the standard way that you might reorganize your code in Meteor when you get to this point of having a fairly complicated application. And the reason for doing it is essentially that in the future it makes it easier to work with the code and to find the things that you want. And also if you then get to the point where maybe other people are working on your code, it becomes simpler because you can have different people working on different things, and it's just easier to work that way. So yeah, it's time to sort of make our app look a bit more like a serious bit of programming. Okay, so let's just go through the code and put it into the right places, and as I go I will explain why we're putting it in those different places. Alright, so here's my application folder, and let's just have a sort of dig around in there. So what have I got so far? I've got my 3 sort of top level files which were created right at the beginning when we created the app. So we've got a CSS file, an HTML file and a JavaScript file. And then I've got this client folder, and you remember I used that to put some configuration stuff in there about the accounts system, the user accounts, and also put some CSS in there which is for the text editor. But let me explain what the client folder actually does. So when you run that Meteor command, Meteor basically takes all the code that you've written and sort of reorganizes it into chunks of sort of meaningful code. And so the first thing it does is it looks in the client folder and collects all of the JavaScript together and combines it with any JavaScript you've got sitting outside of the client folder. So in this case, accounts and TextCircle.js, squashes it together and minifies it, which is a way of kind of removing all the unwanted space from the code to make it as small as possible so that when someone accesses it, it downloads quicker, right? So it gets all the JavaScript and squashes it together. And so the person connecting to your site gets everything that's in the client folder plus anything that's outside of the client folder at the top level. But sometimes there are things that should only go to the server, right? So if you remember, if we look at this file here, we've got a block which says if Meteor is server, right there. So there's no point in having that will be removed anyway and not sent to the client. So what we do is there's a special folder called server wherein we can put code that only needs to go to the server. So let's create that folder, and then we're going to take out the code that is only needed for the server and put it in the server folder. So the code is here, so if Meteor is server, let's grab the whole of that if statement there. Oops, not down to the methods, so we grab the whole of the contents of that if there, and I get a new file, paste it in, and I'm saving this into the server folder main.js. So main.js is a sort of file that Meteor will look for, and it will load that one first. So in case anything depends on it, so the first one we create would normally be called main.js. And actually, I don't need this if statement anymore because if this is in the server folder, it's automatically going to be guaranteed that we are the server. So we don't need that anymore. So we get rid of that and tab it back in. And so there's my server code, right? And my next step is to basically make sure that the client code is going to the client, right? So I've got this is client stuff here. So I can grab all of that client stuff and take it out and then create a new file again, paste it in there. And this one I'm going to save into the client folder as main.js. So this is, if you like, the sort of main set of code that's going to the clients. And again, I don't need the if statement anymore, so I can just knock that out and tab it back in. And there we go. So now I've got 2 main.js files, one that's only got code for the server, one that's only got code for the client. And let's just sort of check that on the application structure there. So there's my client main and my server main. So my next step is to look for code that's going to go to both. So both the client and the server get some of the code, and I can find that, and I'm going to create a folder called shared, right, which says things which are shared between the client and the server. And so I have go back to the main file. So Meteor methods are shared, and so I'll take those and put them in a main folder like that, in a new file, and that goes into shared, again, main.js. Okay, or because it's just methods, it could be called methods.js, but that's okay, we leave that like that. So save that, I'll save this file, and this is now the main JS file that we sort of created right at the beginning, the one we've been working on throughout the course, has now only got some sort of helper functions, which only the client needs, and some collections. So I'm going to take these helper functions and put them in my client main.js file. So I'll whack those at the bottom of there. So remember that we had the one that sort of got the current document and the one that fixed those fields in the objects. Okay, so that's that. And then the final thing is the collections. Now, both the client and the server need the collections, but it's just a little convention that we would, instead of putting it in shared, so we could put the collections in shared, but normally we'd put them in a folder called lib, and lib basically gets dealt with first, so it means we're guaranteed to have the collections ready. So I've created a folder called lib, and I'm now going to save these collections into a new file in lib called collections.js. It could be called main.js, but just because it only has collections in it, it's going to be called collections. Right, so there we have it. And so there's my complete application structure there. And actually this is now empty, so I can get rid of it. And actually the server doesn't need to know about the CSS because it's not rendering HTML. Indeed, it doesn't need to know about HTML either. So I can put both of those into the client folder. So there we have it, my complete fixed structure. So I've got my client folder, which is code that's going to get processed and minified and sent to the client. I've got my lib folder, which gets dealt with first, and there it sets up all the collections, which everything else kind of depends on. I've got my server folder, which gets sort of munged together and minified and sent to the server only. And so I've got my sort of server sensitive stuff in there. And then I've got my shared folder, which is stuff that gets minified and sent to both the client and the server. So the final step is to basically see if it works. So we're just going to make sure all those files are saved. Okay, save them all. And that is my main.js. Right, so then I've got them all in there, and whoops. They're all in there, and now I'm ready to run the Meteor command and see if I've got any errors. I think there might be one or two glitches, but we can, considering I've completely reorganized the application, but we'll have a look. Okay, app is running, and let's just see if it's really running. This looks good. Okay, that's kind of working, and so I can see that there's some stuff working there, so that's good. So the basic application seems to be working still after all that refactoring. So there we go. So I've reorganized my code, and that, you know, you should probably try and do that to your application at this point as well. The topic for this lesson is routing, or if you're more of an American English person, routing. But I'm going to stick to routing because that's the way I pronounce it. So hopefully you'll know what I'm talking about. And the thing is, we've done a bit of fixing and tidying up, but now we're going to do another type of tidying up, but really it's sort of reorganizing the application slightly so that it has a sort of more specific structure. And particularly what I want to do is have two modes, if you like, for the application. So one mode will be where the user lands on the home page of our site and they're just presented with lots of all the different documents that everyone's created. And the second mode is when they actually go in and edit a document. So we've kind of already created the second mode. We've already got document editing, and previously we jumped to different documents by clicking on a link. But I don't really like that drop down, because imagine there's 1,000 documents on there. Suddenly that drop down is completely useless. So it's much easier if we have a sort of grid of all the available documents and they start there. So what we're going to use is the thing called Iron Router, which is a package for Meteor, which we actually taught in the previous course as well. So you might want to go back and revise that, because I'm going to kind of go through it fairly quickly in this course because we've already covered it. But the basic idea is we're going to have two routes. So if we look at the visualization here, we can see what's going to happen. So we're going to have a route 1, which is going to be a responsive grid of all the documents that are available. And we might even implement that infinite scroll that we saw in the previous course. The second route is going to be when someone goes in and looks at a particular document, and then we want to generate the sort of full editing interface. So before we can do it, we need to kind of break up our templates a bit and reorganize them so that we can sort of choose which components of the page we want to load in. So at the moment, if we think about how that editor looks, this is, on the left-hand side here, you've got the sort of the wireframe of the actual design with the nav bar at the top, and then title and so on, all those bits. But in terms of actually the templates, the design on the right shows you what the actual templates are. So what I want to be able to do is essentially separate the nav bar from the content that I'm displaying. So I pretty much always show the nav bar. So if you look on the right again, I've got my I've got all the templates that are required to show the full editing interface, and I'm going to wrap that up in a new template called doc item. And then on the left, I've got this list display, which doesn't exist yet. So I've basically got to create two new templates. So first of all, I'm going to put them all in separate files so that it's a little bit easier to deal with. So I'm going to create a navbar file, a doc list file, and a doc item file. So all the templates are kind of separated like that. So let's go ahead and do that. And so here I am in my application folder as usual, and I'll open it up in the file browser. So let's go in here. So that's where all my templates are at the moment. So the first file is going to be in the client folder, and it's going to be called doc item.html. And into this one, I'm going to pop everything that sort of pertains to showing the editor, which is really all of this stuff like that. So that's the kind of framework, the sort of bootstrap framework of it. And so I'll call that one template name equals doc item. Okay. End of template. And then I'm going to take the actual stuff that's used there. So I'll leave the navbar there for now. What I want is all the templates that I need to make the doc item work. So I'll grab those, jump over here and drop those below it. Right, so what have I done there? So now I've got this kind of doc item file that's got this doc item template, which is what I want. So if we jump back to this view here, so I've now created a doc item template, which then kind of calls in all the other bits that I need for my editor. So I've now sort of made a module, if you like, which is my editor. The next step is to go over here and create this doc list template. So let's do that. So another new file, and this one's called template, end of template, and the name is going to be doc list. And basically I might as well write the code for the template now. It's just going to have a list of documents for now. So we'll say each documents, end of each, and for now I'll just sort of print a title out, title of the document, okay? And then I save that one in the client folder again, and it's going to be called doc list HTML. So I'm nearly there. The final one to do is the navbar, okay? So let's close that up for now. Close that up. And then here's all the stuff for the navbar, and I'll just grab the whole of that, pull it out there, and create a new file and call it navbar. So I've just taken all the navbar template on its own and just stuck it in a new file. That's ready to go. So I can close that. So let's just see what we've done there. So I've now created these three new HTML files, each one containing like a component which I can display. And the idea is that I'll pull in the navbar and then the doc list when they first land on the page, and when they go to click on an item in the list, they then go to the nav bar with the doc item. Okay, so I'm going to end this lesson here and say, right, so I've reorganized my templates. In the next lesson, we're going to then actually install the Iron Router package and see how we can use it to pull in these templates when we want to. Okay, so we've got all of our templates kind of appearing at the right time. And so now we've basically defined two routes. And you can see route 1, it shows the nav bar and the doc list template, which you can see here. But obviously our doc list is pretty rudimentary at the moment. It just prints out all the titles. We'll work on that in this lesson, actually. And then we have our other route, which is the documents route, and that is showing the nav bar plus a single document item. So what we're going to do now is just make a couple of fixes to finish off this topic and make it so that we have a proper responsive grid layout on the documents page, and that we can then move from the document list page through to the documents page. So I can show you how to make those links. So first of all, let's do the links part, because that's kind of easier. So what I have to do is I open up my doc list template here, and I'm going to, instead of just displaying that, I want to display a link. So href, and it's actually very easy to make a link which triggers a route, because what we want to do is when they click on a link, route it into that documents address, right? So we just put / documents, and then where do we get the ID from? Well, easy, we just pull it out of the data context, okay? So remember that we're iterating through the documents, and each time we've got access to the title and all the other stuff in the document, and so we can put out an ID there. And that should do the trick. So if we go back here, if I go back to that / route, now these are links. So if I click on one, it should go to my new document, or new public doc. So you can see it's loading the correct document depending which link I click on. Now I want to make a link that goes back to the sort of list page again. So I'm going to make that text circle brand thing in the top left of the screen there. I'm going to make that a link back to the sort of main page. So let's just go in and edit that. And that one is in the nav bar, so I open up my nav bar template, find there. So you see how we had href is nothing. Well, actually it's just going to go to /. So it'll pull out that kind of document list route. Let's save that, check it out, see if it works. Okay, so now I can go backwards and forwards around in the app. And I can stick this, so clicking on these doesn't work anymore unless I'm in the documents page, but I'm probably going to get rid of that document list. But well, let's leave it there for now because it's kind of handy, and let's just fix the links on that as well using the same technique. Maybe you can think about how we might do it. So we go into the document, the nav bar page again, and there we have a drop down list of document. So again we've got href equals that's actually going to be documents, and the ID is going to be ID. I no longer need this event listener. I don't need to have an event to load the document, because now the router is taking care of loading the document and setting it up on the session. So I get rid of that event class. So now I let the router handle it instead of my event handler. So it's a bit simpler, really. Everything's going through that router. So let's see, do they work now? Yeah, they work on there, but do they work on the main page? Yeah. So I can either go from the list here or from the list in the nav. So maybe what I might do in the future is in that nav just show 4 documents, not the whole lot, maybe the latest ones, or we could convert that into a sort of more focused list of documents, and then on the main page have all of the documents. Right, so the next thing we want to do is create this responsive grid, which instead of just having this slightly naff list of links, we're going to have a nice responsive grid layout where we have a square for each one. So let's see if we can do that. So I go into my document list template, and here, so let's just do some standard Bootstrap stuff. And well, before I do it, let's just look at a visualization of how I'd like this to go. So now I called it a responsive grid. So you'll remember back to when we worked on sort of responsive grids and the idea that yes, we can define a grid in Bootstrap, but we can also set it up so that depending on the size of the screen, the grid actually changes to a different layout. So what I'm going to try and do here is exactly what you can see on the screen here, which is I'll have a grid which is, so if it's on a wide screen, it will show four per row. If it's on a narrow screen, it will only show 2 per row. Because the idea is that if they're looking at this on a mobile phone, we want to change the layout so it's a bit easier to use. You know, this responsive concept which we saw earlier in the courses. So let's go and do that. And so I'm going to create a row. So I'm in my doc list here, and so that's all going inside a row. And then I want each document to take up a number of grid spaces. So remember the grid has got 12 possible spaces in it. So if I want to get 4 things in the grid, each one takes up 3. So I'm going to say class equals col md3. So let's just try that and see how that looks. Okay, so I've got a kind of grid there, and I'm going to put a little border on it. So I want to be able to see. I want to be able to sort of have this nice actual grid. I want to display an actual grid, not just show them like that. So let's see how we do that. We can just put an inner div, which will be end of div class equals light border. Okay, and then we need to specify that class in our CSS file. So let's open it up, go into here, CSS file, and I'll specify something called light border. I'll just put a border. Actually, I'll copy this like that, and then now I can see that. I might just set it to width 100%, so it takes up all of the space in the grid square. Okay, and it's not totally satisfying. I'm going to leave that for you to mess around with the CSS there. That's the basic idea. And let's just create a few new documents just to see what happens when we really fill it up. Okay, and we saw in the previous course again how you can really work with this and maybe use the Bootstrap thumbnail class or something like that. I'm really just interested in the layout. So what happens currently if I make the screen thinner is eventually it drops from having 4 columns down to having just 1 column basically. But I don't want to drop it down to 1 column, I want to drop it down to 2. And the way I do that is, see if you can remember from the earlier bits of the course. So if it's a narrow screen, an extra small screen, then I want it to take up not 3, but 6. So if it takes up 6 for each item, you can imagine I'm only going to get 2 in a row because there's 12 spaces. So I've got 12 spaces, I'm taking up 6 and 6. So that should give me, on a smaller screen, the 2-column view. There we have it, you see. And see, it's dropping from 4 columns down to 2. So that's the basic kind of layout. Obviously, I could spend ages messing around with the CSS and make it look really nice, but I'll leave that for you to do. So there we have it. I've now implemented my basic responsive grid, and I can click on any of these documents and go into the document and load it up. So that's the end of the lesson. we're going to take a little technical aside here and just find out what the difference is between the find function and the find one function. Now obviously we already know that using the find function we can get multiple documents or multiple items from a collection, and with the find one function we only get one if there's one available. But there's a little bit more to it than that, and this difference can sometimes confuse people who are learning Meteor. So let's also, while we're doing this, find out about a new debugging tool which will help us to kind of illustrate the difference and also is useful for debugging your Meteor applications. So first of all, I'm going to set up a little scenario on my website here and then show you through that what I mean about the difference between these two functions. So the scenario is, okay, so I'm in the website here, and so I've just reset the documents. There's nothing in the documents table apart from this one document. So if in my browser I just say documents.find and then count how many I find, you see I've got one document, fine. And if I then log in, oops, okay, shouldn't be any difference. If I add a new document and call it, this one's public, okay, public, oops, doc, that should have created a new one, so now I've got two documents, fine, and then I'm going to create one more document and call it private doc, and that one's going to be set to private. So now I've got the sort of the original document that gets created automatically when the application starts. I've got my public document and my private document, and so how many documents do you think that this person logged in now can see? Well, I created two of them myself, and the other one was the sort of one that everyone can see, so it should be three, right? And indeed it is. So there you go, we've got three coming out there. Now if I log out, you'll then see that I can only see two, which is sensible if we look at the list of documents. So why is that? When I'm logged out, I obviously can't see that private document anymore because only the person who owns it can see the private one. So now I can only see two documents. Okay, great. Now the tool I wanted you to see is called Meteor Shell. So Meteor Shell I can run, I have to be in the same folder as the application, you know, the folder that you always run your application from, and the same folder you would use if you're running Meteor Mongo. So Meteor Shell, you just type that, and so the sort of the scope that I have in this shell is essentially the same as the server scope. So it's as if I'm in one of those blocks where it says if Meteor is server, right? So I've got all the rights that the server has. I don't have the rights that some logged in. I don't need to log in or anything like that. So from the command line in Meteor Shell, you're basically seeing what the server can see. So maybe you can guess how many documents the server can see. 3, right? So the server can see everything, and I didn't need to log in, obviously, in the Meteor Shell. So that just shows you that depending which person is logged in, they get a different view on the documents, and if I'm the server, I get another view. Now, what about the difference between find and find one, which was what we started out discussing? Well, the thing with find is it doesn't just return you an array of documents, which is what you might imagine. So if I was to do this, I get an error, right? So documents find, which should give me an array of documents, and then I say first document, and then give me the title. Whereas if I do documents dot find one, okay, then do the title on that, you can see I actually get a title back. So for some reason, even though I know that I'm getting 3 documents back, I can't pull the title from the first document using array indexing. So how about this? Documents find fetch naught title. Right, so what do you think of that? So if I, in addition to calling find, I call fetch, that actually does give me the array. So what that tells you is what's coming back from find is not the actual documents. Okay, but what comes back from find one is an actual document object you can work with. And so what comes back from find, let's have a look. It's this big complicated thing here that's got Mongo written at the top. So it tells you it's something to do with Mongo. So what actually comes back from find is what we call a cursor, which is a sort of pointer to some list, a collection of documents. So it's a difference, but templates can cope with the data that comes from either. So if you send to a template helper function, you give it one of these cursors, it can iterate that, no problem. If you pass it an array of data, it can also iterate that. And so the templates are clever, they can deal with either. But when you're working your own code, in your JavaScript code, you might get confused because you found, oh, I thought it was an array coming back, but I can't seem to access it. So that is the difference between find and find1. Find passes back a cursor, which can be used to then access more documents, whereas find1 directly gives you back a document. And if you call fetch on a cursor, it gives you all of the documents as an array, which is more like find1. Okay, so that's the end of that lesson.